Talks about Donald Trump. Diversity appears to be the only thing that it really... He talks about that all the time. And, you know, fantastic and all the rest of it, but there's other things going on.
Knife crime, gun crime, robbery.
Knife crime, all of that. We've got 20 seconds, Jonathan. What is happening after the news?
We're going to be looking at why Keir Starmer wants 10 years to run Britain and God save the country.
Yeah, should be given 10 years, I know that much. Listen. Jonathan Gullis is going to be here after the news. 7 o'clock this evening, the fabulous... Kevin O'Sullivan is here, of course, with his political asylum. All the breaking news, everything you need to know right here on Talk. And the news at 4 o'clock is next.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome here to the home of common sense on Talk TV. You're joined by me, Jonathan Gullis, former Conservative Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North, former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. And I'm delighted to be here on the great station that is Talk, so we can hear your views and get your opinions. So make sure throughout the show that you call 0344 499 1000, you text in with the word Talk at the beginning to 87222, and you can follow us and message us on X at Talk TV. I'm delighted that in the studio I'm joined by Conservative commentator and Conservative councillor, former Deputy Leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council, Daniel Jellyman, who joins me in the studio. Nice to see you, Dan.
Great to be here, Jonathan.
No, delighted. And we're also going to be joined in this first hour by the former Deputy Chairman of Reform UK, that is Mr Ben Habib. But quickly, before I go to Ben, we're going to be talking about the grooming gang scandal. Let's be honest, rape gangs that have been plaguing our towns and our cities across the United Kingdom, and how the Labour Party under Yvette Cooper has come up with one of the weakest ideas in the history of Home Secretaries, which is to have some pathetic, measly, mild inquiry that will last a matter of 3 months, that will only cover 5 of the 50 towns that have been listed, that will only cost 10 million when Telford on its own cost £8 million will not be a national inquiry, and the victims are outraged, most importantly, because there will be no ability to force witnesses to come before these inquiries. That means, let's be perfectly frank, police officers, counsellors, social workers, God forbid teachers, who were all aware or knew what was going on, yet turned a blind eye or chose not to take action in the interests of not upsetting a certain demographic in this country, predominantly British Pakistanis who are involved in these grooming gangs, all in the interest of making sure that we worried about the diversity, equality and agenda over the interests of keeping predominantly young white British girls safe on the streets of our communities is an absolute outrage and something that disgusts me. And I know Ben Habib has been making a lot of noise about this. So Ben, I know you're joining us down the line. How are you, sir?
Very well indeed, thank you, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Ben. Now, Ben, what did you make? I was being pretty harsh there. Maybe you think I've been unfair, or maybe you think I've not been hard enough. What do you make of Yvette Cooper's sellout to the victims of these rape gangs?
I thought your description was absolutely right. Perhaps the only other thing I would add, a couple of things I would add to it, is there is no emphasis, as far as I can see in the terms of reference of the, I think she's setting up 5 different inquiries, no requirement for those inquiries to look at what it was in our institutional framework that enabled these rape gangs, as you rightly call them, to go about doing what they did without being challenged. How it is that the police forces, the various police forces, the social services, the local councils, teachers, medical services didn't stand up and blow the whistle on what must have been self-evidently going on. And that's absent from the terms of references. And whilst, of course, it's important to shine a light on the ethnicity of these people and speak about that without fear or favour, to understand what it is about the multicultural divide, the many multicultural divides in our country now that are creating pockets of perhaps culturally driven bad behavior. What's equally important, and you touched on it, is that the diversity, the drive towards diversity, shouldn't be used as a cloak to prevent those who should have been protecting these young girls from being brought to account. And that is conspicuously absent from the terms of reference. That's the first thing I'd say. And then the second thing I'd say is, you know, if you're going to chuck 10 million quid at, I think it's 5 million to start with, you know, it's not going to go very far if you've got 5 different inquiries all doubling up, doing the same thing, same level of overhead, without, you know, using economies of scale that come from a larger inquiry. The COVID inquiry cost 350 million quid. Do they think they're going to get to the bottom of decades of gang raping, gang raping, gang behaviour, that's correct, by setting up 5 independent inquiries with £1 million each? They're not going to do it. And of course, then the public start thinking, as I do, as I'm sure you do, is why the devil aren't they facing up to this reality? Are they ideologically hijacked and unable to really dispense criminal justice in the way that it should be blindly? Or are they running scared of something else? You know, why is it that our young girls in this country are not going to get the proper light shone on this horrendous issue? Well,
Ben, I think you've hit a lot of points there that I completely concur with. I mean, my biggest frustration in all this is that Labour has been so busy talking about Elon Musk and trying to make this some online spat, rather than actually understand that the anger of the British public, and particularly the anger, most importantly, of the victims, is that whilst the perpetrators in some cases have been arrested and have been sentenced, albeit not for long enough, and they should have been deported in many cases for those who are foreign national offenders or hold dual nationality, the truth of the matter is, as you say, it's the cover-up here. It's the fact that we know there are people in our institutions, in our establishment, who turned a blind eye, neglected their responsibilities and their duties to protect people, and most importantly, once again, are now looking after themselves, walking away with big, hefty, gold-plated public sector pensions, rather than face the justice that they deserve, or sorry, that they need to face, so the victims get the justice that they deserve. I'm absolutely appalled, and yet again, it's no shock to me that the establishment is doing everything it can, and why Labour is getting busy into a row with Elon Musk, who I think, by the way, is a hero for having raised this issue and for forcing the government into this position. Don't you agree with me that I think it was Chris Bryant, the minister, that has admitted that it was Elon Musk that forced this government to take action. Why is it taking a immigrant to America from South African heritage who just happens to own a social media platform to force the UK government to take seriously these rape gangs?
Absolutely, and he's absolutely right to have done it. Delighted he's done it, and I hope he shines a light through that medium on other atrocities and difficulties and failures of our own government. I mean, this is one of the great things, I'm digressing slightly, but it's one of the great things about the change of governance that we're now going to see across the Atlantic. They're going to do away with DEI and progressive discrimination and all the crazy net zero agenda, no borders. They're going to do away with all of that. There's going to be a dramatic change in the way the United States is governed. And we better get on the same boat. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind and economically left in a backwater, not to mention, you know, from an ideological perspective, whether the US will even see us as an equal partner. I mean, again, I just want to mention something that's really interesting to me. I read a bit about Herma today. You probably know more about Herma, the Attorney General appointed by the Labour Party to that office. This is a man who's got a senior position in our criminal justice system, the ability to bring cases against people, who defended Jerry Adams, who defended people who were illegal migrants who were claiming to be younger than they are. And yet he and also turning civil cases into criminal cases, politically charged. You know, how can we have a settled British society if our society can't be confident that our criminal justice system works blindly? It has to work blindly. It can't be politically discriminatory. It can't discriminate either negatively or positively in favor of a certain group of people. But that is what we are seeing repeatedly out of our criminal justice system. So I'm absolutely glad, coming around full circle, that Elon Musk has shone a light on this.
Well, Ben, before I come back to you, I was going to bring back in Councillor Daniel Jellyman from Stoke-on-Trent City Council, obviously former deputy leader of that local authority when the Conservatives were controlling it. Daniel, Stoke-on-Trent is mentioned in numerous local inquiries as an area. You yourself have served on panels where I know you've raised particular questions, particularly around taxi drivers. Are you appalled that it's being led to local authorities like Stoke-on-Trent, for example, to, if they want to have an inquiry, rather than the government just take firm action in an area that we know will have a large amount of deprived white English girls who will be, sadly, the type of victims that would be preyed on from particularly Telford and other areas, Rochdale, which are not far from our city?
Well, the key thing here is these cities are linked. A lot of the grooming and the gangs that go on, they're not just isolated in one city, they cross borders. We hear about the drugs crossing borders, these poor girls which are being trafficked across local authority boundaries. So it's poor practice just to say the local authority should look at this, or we should have locally led inquiries. It's a national problem. These girls are transported and boys are transported across boundaries. You can't just leave it down to local councils to lead on this, particularly when local councils are finding it even more and more difficult to do everyday services because the government continues to cut funding.
And what's your view, Daniel, as well about the inability to compel witnesses? I mean, surely it makes a mockery if you're having to ask but can't demand that people face questions. Do you worry that within our establishment, within our institutions, there is now a big cover-up going on, in fact, that people are looking after their own backs in this case, rather than actually getting the answers that these victims deserve?
Oh, absolutely. And we saw this with the Post Office, didn't we? And that's now led to a national inquiry, and we're seeing what's coming out of that. The same will happen if we have a national inquiry about grooming gangs. There's loads of institutions caught up in this, from the police to local authorities to social care to the courts. I've served on the licensing panel on the City Council where we looked at taxi drivers' licences, and we've revoked licences from people that were quite clearly engaged in illegal behaviour in this nature, only for the courts to give them their licence back.
I mean, Ben, that must be shocking to hear that a sitting councillor has actually tried to take action, try to take away the ability of these people to access these girls that are being raped, and yet courts have worked against the interest and the mission of the council, the values of the council. Ben, do you think there's a big cover-up going on here? I know people will quickly say, oh, this is some sort of conspiracy theory on the left.
No, it's not
though, is
conspiracy.
It?
It's not conspiracy theory. I mean, we see two-tier justice in practice all the time. The two Manchester airport chaps have only just been arrested, whereas after the Southport protests, you know, Keir Starmer got up, categorised everyone as far right, and instructed the criminal justice system to detain and and incarcerate anyone who's involved. And they did it in double quick time. And yet Rudy Cabana, who was the perpetrator of the crimes in Southport, is yet to face trial. I mean, the whole thing has just gone, belly up. And I think Daniel's absolutely right to make the point that this is systemic across the country. This is not from one local authority to another. This is across boundaries. And you will only get a proper analysis if you look at the systemic failure that's taking place. You can't do that if you look at it on a local basis. And the way that you set the terms of reference basically make it impossible, as you've also indicated, Jonathan, not having the right to compel witnesses to come forward. I mean, if you don't have that right, you're not going to make any progress, full stop. I mean, frankly, this discussion starts and ends on that point, doesn't it?
I completely agree with you. And Daniel, out of interest, obviously, we've seen the Labour Party say we don't need a national inquiry. They've now made a step, albeit a tiny one, into doing something in order to try and hope that the heat will get taken off them. Do you think we'll eventually see some capitulation here? Because surely this doesn't end well for the government, that they think this is over. No way is Elon Musk, I think, going quiet on this. Do you think there should be a national inquiry? And do you think someone like Stoke-on-Trent, at the very least, should be given the finances to hold their own local one at the very least, so we can shine a light on if there's anything going on in that great city?
Yes, absolutely. But that's where it comes down to, isn't it? It's got to be a national inquiry. And they've already taken that step now to say, oh, well, because of pressure, we'll have some local inquiries. So they're only probably a few weeks or a couple of months away from announcing a national inquiry.
Does it shock you that this Labour Party is being dragged into a national inquiry on an issue that surely, when they've had bad headline after bad headline, this would be the easiest win of all, just to say, we're going to have a national inquiry, we want to unearth what's been going on, and we'll prosecute aggressively those taking place, just like Keir Starmer was happy to prosecute those who said some very unsavoury things on social media, but ultimately it was on social media and was not responsible for the actions of others who chose to commit awful violence on the streets in places like Stoke-on-Trent over the summer.
Yes, and I think it shows the incompetency of the current government, really. I don't think things are going to get any better anytime soon.
Now, Ben, I'm glad you brought up the Attorney General, because I was gobsmacked when he was grilled. I think it was by Sir Ashley Fox, a Conservative Member of Parliament, in a select committee, who was asking him about his business dealings with Gerry Adams. As you said, we are now seeing Labour repeal legislation that I actually was working on with Sir Brandon Lewis in the Northern Ireland office that would protect our veterans from vexatious claims. And what's going to happen instead is we're going to give cuts to granny and cash to people like Gerry who have committed these awful crimes. Do you think it is an absolute abomination, first of all, that we're allowing our British veterans to be risked? And do you also agree with me that it's wholly unfair? It looks dodgy, as far as I'm concerned. It looks uncomfortable that the Attorney General, who was the client lawyer for Gerry Adams, who made, I think now it's been reported in the Times, £30,000 from being his lawyer, is going to be part of the same cabinet that chooses to revoke this legislation that would financially benefit Gerry Adams himself. It doesn't look great, does it?
I think it's repugnant. I mean, for those of us who lived through the Troubles, and obviously the Troubles were prevalent in London, the way that they were bombing London, we all know the victims got no compensation. Our soldiers were hauled through the courts and continue to be hauled through the courts. And yet sections 46 and 47, which removed the ability for people like Gerry Adams to claim compensation, because, I mean, there's a technicality. I don't know if you've looked at it in detail. The reason Gerry Adams can, on prima facie, claim compensation is because it wasn't the Secretary of State that ordered his detention. It was another minister in government. The fact is he was lawfully detained, and you were right as the Conservative government to make sure that people like him couldn't use that technicality to make a compensation claim. And now Labour have homed in on those two sections, those very sections that you correctly put in as a Conservative government to prevent that from happening, to revoke them. Again, another example of basically a politicized approach to criminal justice. Gerry Adams is an enemy of the United Kingdom. At no level can I make any case for compensation for Gerry Adams, or indeed anyone in the IRA. And I find it, while I'm on this topic, absolutely repugnant that neither Michelle O'Neill nor Mary Lou MacDonald will condemn the IRA. That even now we have a First Minister in Northern Ireland who will not condemn terrorism. Absolutely unbelievable. What a state of affairs the United Kingdom has come to, that one of its first ministers, by the way, I would abolish devolution, but one of its first ministers would not denounce the IRA. Outrageous. And now to be giving Jerry Adams the ability to get compensation, Hermer should be sacked. And I just want to say one more thing. Kemi Badenoch, we haven't mentioned her. Actually, Elon Musk shone a light on this, but it's Kemi who's really brought the importance of a national inquiry into the public psyche. She's the one who's been saying, we need a national inquiry. And she's won that debate. And I think it's her first significant victory as leader of the opposition.
No, I totally agree with you on that particular point with Kemi. I think it was a huge victory for her. And ultimately, I would also say this. I'm really proud and want to say thank you, Ben, for all your passion that you show for Northern Ireland. It's an issue that's close to my heart due to my own family. It's also an issue close to my heart, having served in the Northern Ireland office as a parliamentary private secretary. And it's an important part of our union. I was proud to vote against the Windsor Framework, which makes a mockery of Northern Ireland by by drawing a line in the Irish Sea between England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, which allows the EU a backdoor to try and introduce their ridiculous rules and regulations, which is still being beholden upon the United Kingdom. And I want to say, as someone who's a proud unionist, thank you for what you do, for standing up on an issue that I think many people would say most people aren't interested in. But if they're not interested in it, they don't understand the damage it will do if you don't retain Northern Ireland's place in our precious union. Ben Habib, thank you so much for joining the show today. We must quickly go to the break. Remember, call 0344 499 1000, text in with the word talk at the start to 87222, or follow us on X at talkTV.
The Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes. How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation service? A convicted killer, no less. All praise to the Sun newspaper, all shame to the probation service.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
My name's Jonathan Gullis. I'm on Talk here, the home of common sense, and I'm delighted that you're joining us here on Drive Time today. Now, Keir Starmer has said that he wants to spend 10 years as our country's Prime Minister. This is not April Fool's Day, please be warned, and if you're triggered by this, now's the time to have a stern cup of British tea. I am absolutely aghast that Sir Keir Starmer thinks anything other than he'll be lucky to survive for 10 months with the way things that this Labour government has done. Let's be quite frank. We've got cuts for Granny and cash for Jerry. We've had the winter fuel payment axed for 10 million pensioners in our country, that £300 to keep their houses warm over the winter, whilst repealing legislation that stops British veterans being dragged unnecessarily and unfairly through the courts of Northern Ireland, and giving people like Jerry Adams, who have either represented political parties that were the wings of the former IRA, in order to get cash from the British taxpayer. We've got the family farm tax. That means that British farmers are at risk of an all-time high, which will only see prices on our supermarket shelves increase as we rely on more imports, and people who have looked after the land for hundreds of years being forced to give it up, all because Sir Keir Starmer wants to give the same amount of money he'll raise overseas to foreign farmers. We've also got the Chagos Islands, a piece of British sovereignty that allows us to be able to make sure we can keep our eyes trained on China. Sir Keir Starmer not only wants to give it away to Mauritius, which is basically in China's pocket, he also wants to give £9 billion worth of taxpayers' money to do it. 6 years of winter fuel payments, all because he does not believe in our sovereignty. He wants to have a jobs tax, the national insurance increase for employers, that's going to see jobs lost, investment down, and essentially see local councils put under more pressure. I can tell you, exclusively here on Talk, that Stoke-on-Trent City Council is going to be £1 million short in government funding to cover the increase of those they directly employ to their national insurance. So that's going to mean any extra money they've had in revenue increases is going to have to be spent on covering the tax that Labour introduced. The Halloween budget continues to haunt the nation. Debt up, inflation up, tax up, mortgage rates up. And what does that mean for you? More money out of your pocket, more money coming out of your for your weekly shop, more money coming to enable you to buy a home, and more money on energy, because we've got mad Ed Miliband, who seems to be hell-bent on chasing the admiration of Greta Thunberg over the interest of the British public. No coal coming out from Carlisle or from the northwest. No North Sea oil drilling. Instead, we're going to apparently have solar farms all over our country. GB Energy that produces no energy at the cost of £8 billion to the British taxpayer. And of course, the banning, as I say, of drilling in the North Sea oil. We should be drill away, baby, in that North Sea in order to use all those amazing natural resources that we have. We've got the £10 billion in inflation-busting pay rises. That means that when we were told there's a £22 billion black hole, we can apparently pay train drivers an extra £10,000. And guess what, folks? Today it's breaking that train drivers aren't going to agree to the 4.5% pay rise for this year. They might go on strike again to take more money out of your pocket, those greedy so-and-sos. £11 billion given in climate change aid overseas. Again, playing virtue signalling on the world stage rather than looking after our pensioners. And we've got no details on, obviously, NHS reforms, just giving more money to it. And, of course, a national rape gang inquiry, which the Labour government is opposing. That is the charge sheet against this Labour Party. I can't believe for a single second Keir Starmer thinks he's going to last more, as I say, than 10 months. But John Rentoul is joining me, a great chief political commentator from The Independent, who is hopefully going to tell me why I'm wrong. John, it's great to have you on the show again.
It does sound very bad from the way you put it, I must say. I mean, I think Keir Starmer should come out of number 10 now with his hands up. He's not in number 10. He's in Poland, isn't he? Well, he should come back from Poland. He should get off the plane. He should come to talkTV towers and surrender.
Well, John, I'm delighted to hear that you think I've been that persuasive in my argument. But of course, maybe I'm just being a miserable so-and-so, John, and this is why I need to hear from you.
It's a bit one-sided, actually, Jonathan. I thought to say that inflation is up and interest rates are up when inflation was down on Wednesday.
It's still up from when they came into government, John, aren't they? It's still up from when they came into government.
It was down. It was lower than expected. Interest rates. Everybody was very excited about long-term 30-year interest rates last week, and saying Rachel Reeves would have to resign. They're now back down to where they were before. People started panicking.
They also said that, John, after the budget, didn't they? After the budget, there was a panic. Then things went calm. Then we had another panic again. So it would be wrong to assume there won't be another panic in the future.
Well, of course, yes. I mean, so, yeah, week by week, there'll be fluctuations. And it'll go up and it'll go down. I mean, it's absurd to call for the resignation of the Chancellor just because of 1 week's figures. So, yeah, no, things are not nearly as bad as you're suggesting. But equally, I have checked this story that Keir Starmer wants to be Prime Minister for 10 years. What he was actually saying, he was referring to Boris Johnson, who did say that he wanted to be Prime Minister for 10 years. And he was pointing out that was only 4.5 years ago. And, things do change. And then people have also pointed out that Keir Starmer has talked of a decade of national renewal. He's sort of set out a manifesto for two terms, but he hasn't linked that personally to his own ambition to stay in number 10 himself for 10 years.
But John, Keir Starmer bet the house on growth, and at best, we've had 0.1%, which I'm not going to be grateful for when they've had 0% and effectively talked themselves into recession. Rachel from accounts has managed to almost crash the economy.
You're not allowed to use that. You're not allowed to use that term. It's boring now.
It might be boring, John, to you, but it's not boring to the great British people who are sick and tired of Rachel Reeves or Rachel Thieves. There you go. There's another one for you.
It's sexist. It's classist.
It's not sexist, John. Come on. It's Rachel Thieves, okay? Is robbing pensioners, robbing farmers, but happy to give money away to foreign farmers, setting up a GB energy company with a mate Ed Miliband.
That was Tory policy.
Setting up her Ed Miliband.
Foreign aid budget is Tory policy.
Well, John, I think you know my views on foreign aid. Let's be frank here. I think I'm one of the most authentic voices that we should be scrapping the whole thing entirely. We shouldn't be giving away British taxpayers money.
That wasn't your government's policy.
And the Labour government could have chosen to not give that 11 billion overseas, but of course they want to virtue signal on the world stage. I mean,
so did your lot.
I'm desperate, John, to find out what Labour's doing well. Please tell me, what is Labour doing well? What have I missed?
Well, I mean, broadly speaking, I think Rachel Reeves has taken the right approach. She's restored the public finances. She inherited them in a terrible state. She had to protect public services, so she's put more money into the NHS in particular, and she's had to raise taxes, and that's uncomfortable.
John,
and all
local councils,
very difficult for people.
John, local councils aren't getting enough money to even cover the national insurance increase.
Right, so you want to put taxes up even more?
No, I don't want to put taxes up even more. I don't want more taxes on employers, working people. Something that Keir Starmer couldn't even describe what working person was. And actually, at the end of the day, you've just seen that we're going to see a city council directly impacted in Stoke-on-Trent by the increase in employers' NICs directly, not including the impact they'll see to services that they outsource, particularly in children and adult social care. This Labour government is going to bankrupt public services. At the same time, it's going to bankrupt the private sector by deterring investment and undermining jobs in this country. They are destroying the economic evidence, John, is not looking good. The fact that we're seeing long-term debt, which I know you said is something we shouldn't worry about, but the interest rates of our debt is higher than it is in Germany. It is a real concern that debt is going up, growth is going down, or if not happening at all, let's be perfectly frank, in this great nation.
Jonathan, we've just had the IMF today saying that Britain's going to upgrading its forecast for growth.
The IMF is never right.
Britain's going to have the fastest growth in Europe. Oh well, in that case. Then,
I don't take the IMF. Come on, no one takes the IMF seriously. Okay, let's be perfectly frank. Their forecasting is about as predictable as me knowing the lottery numbers every week. It is for the birds that we should believe the IMF. The OBR.
Well, I'm sure you know better.
The OBR. Well,
I don't think you believe the OBR.
Well, the OBR has been very clear, John, that they think Labour's jobs tax is going to undermine jobs and cost jobs.
No, it doesn't.
They said that there's not going to be 20. They said this £22 billion black hole didn't exist. They couldn't substantiate that at all for the Labour government. They actually said it's about $9.5 billion, which guess what? They gave away in inflation-busting pay rises.
No, those were essential to maintain public services. I mean, the Tory government would have had to do exactly the same.
John, there was more money in the NHS than ever before, £160 billion a year in the NHS, and yet productivity was not improving. And Labour have talked about reforms, but we're yet to see any reforms. It's all well and good throwing money,
at least,
but we don't know what the hell's going to actually happen to improve productivity.
But at least we're moving in the right direction now. Whereas under the Conservatives, I'm afraid the NHS was in a terrible state and flat on its back.
John, you know I love you. You know I love you, John. But the pollsters are not agreeing with you.
How to reform it?
Are the pollsters wrong? Do you think the pollsters are wrong in what they're saying right now about popularity of Sir Keir Starmer, popularity of this Labour government?
No, Keir Starmer's very unpopular. Yeah, no, I accept that. He's had a terrible start, but that is partly because he's had a terrible inheritance from your lot.
Oh, John, I love you. I'm glad to have you on the show, and I look forward to seeing you around, hopefully, Westminster sometime soon. Thanks so much to John Rentoul for joining us. You're here on the home of Common Sense at Talk. Make sure you call 0344 499 1000. Text in with the word Talk at the start to 87222, and follow us on X at talkTV. This is the home of Common Sense at Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here to the home of common sense on Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis, stepping in today on Drive Time. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Councillor Daniel Jellyman, Conservative Councillor in Stoke-on-Trent City Council and the former Deputy Leader of the City Council. Daniel, before we get to my next guest, can I just quickly get a reaction there to John Rentoul, who told us everything's actually on the right track, that Rachel Reeves is doing a good job, and it's just all the Conservatives' fault. Now, by the way, listeners, I'm going to be very clear with you. The Conservative Party absolutely has to own up to the mistakes it made. But do you find it a bit rich that apparently all of these decisions being made can be squared solely on the door of the Conservative Party?
Well, that's complete and utter rubbish, and John needs to go out from the M25 ring road and go and speak to people in the rest of the country and see shops closing down, restaurants closing, logistics companies are laying off staff. There's no work out there, there's no wealth out there. It's a direct consequence of the budget from October. So he's totally and utterly wrong, and it's a London-centric view.
Now, you represent the city, and you've actually yourself worked in the ceramics industry. The increase in employers' national insurance, the reduction on the business rates for hospitality sector, which, you know, is your restaurants, as you say, your cafes that buy the plates and the crockery that's made in Stoke-on-Trent, and the net zero agenda, which is going to be harming the industry by putting all the green taxes that they're facing, and the net zero agenda, which has not come up with a solution to be able to fire a kiln at the right temperature to make a plate. Do Labour understand places like Stoke-on-Trent? They understand that this industry that the city is named after is already on its knees, and this could be the final thing that puts it out of business?
Well, not only do Labour not understand the ceramics industry in Stoke-on-Trent, they don't understand any industry. They don't understand any manufacturing in this country. They've totally and utterly lost their connection with it. But we've seen this from the 1980s onwards. Tony Blair's government didn't do anything for industry in this country, and Keir Starmer's government's not going to make any difference either.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that important comments. Now, we're going next to to a guest who's a former colleague of mine, former Conservative Member of Parliament for the Great Isle of Wight. That is Bob Seeley. Bob, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Hi, Jonathan. I'm all the world for chatting with you. It's great to see you. Very well done.
We could have just done this over the phone, but I thought, why not bring the world in to hear what we have to say about these important issues?
Yeah, we could have done over the phone, over a beer, or on the radio. Yeah,
absolutely. Bob, if I come to the first important point, something I know you've been very vocal about. Obviously, we are seeing that we're now getting closer and closer to agreement to a permanent or to a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. First of all, I wanted to get your view on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and whether or not this is something that you think could become a permanent ceasefire overall.
Okay, anything that stops people being killed is a good thing, provided it isn't just an excuse for Hamas to rearm and start killing Jews again, and then, you know, in the process they will get lots of Palestinians killed. So because the fighting has stopped and the killing has stopped, that is a good thing. Do I think it's a permanent ceasefire? I think the Israelis are going to get, in the first tranche, there's 3 stages to this process. So in the first bit, they start releasing Palestinian prisoners, and Hamas give up 33 Israeli hostages. Some of these people are very old, some of them, toddlers, incredibly young. All the Palestinians being given up are probably 99% fighting age males. Then there's going to be more talks about talks. And the question is then, is it going to stick? I think my gut feeling in Israel is that the war has sort of run its course for the moment, because Hamas has been so degraded, Hezbollah has been so degraded. The question is, are they going to try to recoup for round 2? Eventually Hamas are going to do that, and this is probably going to happen, and it's just going to be unfortunately cyclical, because you've got an organisation dedicated to the slaughter of Jews and the overthrow of the State of Israel. Israel's got a right to defend itself.
I think that's a brilliant synopsis that you've given out there, Bob. My concern is that for every hostage that's freed, I think the ratio is reported around to be 30 to 50 terrorists or criminals who have been imprisoned to be released back. And as you say, many of those will probably have links to terrorist organisations, Hezbollah or Hamas indeed. And ultimately will start essentially the rearming process, I think, which is why I'm sure you will share my sentiment that until all hostages are released, Israel has every right, as far as I'm concerned, to undertake military action in Gaza to bring their people back. But do you think that if this deal does go through, Netanyahu is likely to stay on. It's a lot of talk that the coalition is on the verge of collapsing, and maybe with a new face as the head of the Israeli government, and maybe if the Palestinian Liberation Authority, who I hope would finally find some backbone to take charge of the situation, then a two-state solution could be found.
I think it's too, I think two-state solution is a pipe dream. I really do. I think Palestinian society is so damaged, in part by Israel, but in part by its own vile and chronic leadership, especially under the PLO for decades, when it was basically a Soviet front, or certainly used and armed by the Soviets. And they have been, the time for peace was back around late 90s and early 2000s. And since then, it's just got more desperate. So I don't see a happy future for the Palestinians, I'm afraid, especially when Israel has been ruthless about protecting its own people, and it's done absolute harm to Hamas, absolute harm to Hezbollah, and really trashed the Iranian proxy forces all over the Middle East. That is ruthless democracy in action for you. And I think when it comes to Netanyahu, I think he'll be out. I think there'll be an election, and I think a lot of Jewish voters, and indeed Arab voters in Israel as well, because there's Arabs and Jews who live there, I think they will remember the mistakes that Netanyahu made, and I think probably they will get rid of him. I'm not sure that's going to change much as regards Israel's pretty ruthless approach to its enemies.
Quickly on this topic, before I come to some other ones I want to speak to you, Bob. President-elect Trump, soon-to-be President Trump, was very, very clear, I think it's fair to say, at last week's press conference, that if the hostages were not released and a deal was not done, he would rain hell upon Gaza. Do you think President Trump has already shown his impact on the world stage when it comes to bringing about peace? Do you think this is a welcome intervention by him, or do you think this is the success of the Biden administration?
The trouble is, when he says rain down hell, I'm not sure what that means, because you can't just bomb people indiscriminately, because it'll get the Americans into a hell of a trouble. And I think, so I'm unclear. Look, if you look at Republicans and what they're saying on social media and elsewhere, this is Trump's first great victory. If you look at what Biden supporters are saying, this is Biden's last great victory. So I just think, I know, Jonathan, I know that you like Trump a bit more than I do. I think he's a bit all over the shop. He shakes things up, which we both like, but I also think that he can be pretty irresponsible, and I'm a bit dubious about how he treats and takes the Russians and the Ukrainians. So let's see. But I mean, I like the fact that he doesn't like Iran, and I like the fact that he's a strong supporter of Israel, because Israel has the right to defend itself. And I think that is something that we can all agree with, even actually most Arab states.
No, look, as you say, with President Trump, I like the fact that he's a strong man. I think that to stand up to dictators who seek to do democracies and people on the West harm, you need to have strong voices that you can trust and rely on. But I do, and the unpredictability, I think, is something that actually can be an advantage. However, I agree with you on Ukraine. I have a slightly different position to President-elect Trump on that. I think it's important that's the frontier that we defend on, because history is a great teacher. And we know that
get him on your show.
Putin will not stop.
Jonathan.
Well, I hope so. But I would also like to come to you the fact that we've also seen sort of inside reports about the fact that the defence review that's being undertaken is suggesting that actually, despite what Labour was saying, will not see an increase in armed forces personnel, numbers-wise. And that is leading to a lot of discomfort behind the scenes, particularly when we are trying to reach 2.5% of GDP on defence, and Labour's meant to be setting out this path. Do you think this is a betrayal to the armed forces and another sign of a broken promise by this Labour government?
I do, but I mean, let's emotive language aside, we need to defend ourselves, and we're not defending ourselves enough. And actually what that means is that we just have a lesser and lesser say. I find that very frustrating. As a former serviceman, as someone who's done quite a few tours of duty, I find it very, very painful. And I find it painful because it's also incredibly unnecessary. If we actually ran this state a bit better, whether it's the Tories or Labour in power, we should have a bigger army. We should have a bigger navy, bigger air force. Britain remains a great power with global reach. I'm fed up with people talking us down. We're not a superpower. We don't pretend to be, but we have still a significant and important role to play. And what really grips me is when you've got people like, and we did it a little bit as well, but I'm afraid to say nowhere near Starmer. He sort of says, I'll do whatever it takes. And the problem is Starmer's got a track record. He just says whatever he needs to at the time with zero intent on following through. So we've got him even today, or yesterday, when he was in Kiev, basically saying, we'll do whatever it takes. We'll preserve our great armed forces. We'll support the Ukrainians. Are they spending more money? No. They've got 9 billion to give away to Mauritius to hand over our sovereign territory to a country that's never ever possessed it. You know, messing up our relationship with the Americans and making ourselves look like international muppets of the First Order. So we've got billions for trendy left-wing causes. We don't have it for the army.
I don't think there is any better way to end this segment. Thank you, Bob, for joining us today, former Conservative Member of Parliament for the Isle of Wight. We're about to take a short break. Remember to keep listening in here on the Home of Common Sense at Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis. You can call in at 0344 499 1000. You can text the word TALK to 87222 and follow us on social media at talkTV. We'll be listening to you, reading out your messages and maybe take a few phone calls after this break.
The Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes. How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation service? A convicted killer, no less. All praise to the Sun newspaper, all shame to the probation service.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to Talk, the home of common sense with me, Jonathan Gullis, and the switchboard is lighting up. The messages are flowing in. You've certainly got opinions, and I'm going to share some of them with you now. We've got Gary Mitchell here, who said, how can John Rentoul talk about the terrible legacy that the Conservatives left the incoming Labour government when you look at what the last Labour government left the Conservatives in 2010? Even if we add this fictitious £20 billion black hole to the actual budget deficit for 2024, it's less than 5% of GDP. Well, back in 2010, Labour were running a budget deficit of 10% of GDP, twice as much. And let's not forget the note they left in the Treasury saying there's no money left. The public are not to be fooled, John. I've said this to you. They know more than what we give them credit for in Westminster. And another message coming in saying, Labour seems to forget COVID bankrupted the country. They wanted more lockdowns, longer lockdowns. Both sides of the House are to blame for the financial mess. Labour have made things worse. That's Jane. But we're now going to quickly take our first caller very briefly. His name is Derek. He is in Manchester and it's about the grooming gangs. Derek, how are you?
I'm not too bad. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for joining us here on Talk. What do you want to tell us?
Well, I really don't think that with any chance whatsoever of having any meaningful inquiry into what happened all those years ago, because there's far too many people compromised, both in government, because don't forget, it was under the last Labour government that all this originally broke. And contrary to what I keep hearing saying, people keep saying, oh yeah, it's been going on since sort of 2009 and all this sort of thing. I know for a fact because I followed the trial of Nick Griffin in 2004, and he was actually put on trial for bringing that to the attention, and the press, the media, and everyone covered it up. So there's an awful lot of people responsible for this not coming to light, isn't there?
Derek, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for calling in. We really appreciate that call, and you are the voice of the country when it comes to saying that we need a national inquiry. We need those in power held accountable, not just those who committed the awful crimes. And those who committed the awful crimes should have been locked up for longer, and those who have got our foreign nationals or hold dual nationality should be immediately on planes and deported from this country. Rupert Lowe, who's a Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, has been making that point, and he is bang on the money. But let's get to a few other stories with my guest in the studio, Councillor Daniel Jellyman from Stoke-on-Trent City Council, Conservative councillor, former deputy leader. Daniel, we've seen that there's a fun story here going on. I say fun, but it's also sad, but you know this because you spent some time in this part of the world. Gloucestershire County Council has been forced to apologise to farmers for causing offence with their Swaps in Seconds campaign. This is when dairy farmers are urging its residents to consider climate-friendly alternatives to milk. Is this just another example of virtue signalling and just winding up the British public who are not interested in this nonsense?
Absolutely. I think it's a classic case of some officers have decided this is what we should do, and they put it out there without any kind of political oversight. And, for a place like Gloucestershire, where they've got hundreds of dairy farmers, they're a huge contributor to the economy of the southwest. They've got every right to be annoyed at the county council for even suggesting this.
If this had come across the desk when you were leading or deputy leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council, where would you have told officers to stuff it?
Well, we did actually have this. We had officers saying we need to tell schools to be vegetarian only, and as a result of that, we told them no thanks. It's not up to the state. It's not up to the local council to tell parents what their children should eat. They should make their own decisions.
Well, how terrifying that we've got officials trying to push this woke nonsense. Another story that we'll be looking at is, of course, the BBC yet again has got itself in hot water. The big exclusive from The Sun was into this drill rapper who ended up being promoted by the BBC, having been boasting about the crime, the murder that he committed in his music. Now, I don't think it would take a genius at the BBC to have probably done a little bit of background research into this individual, who, by the way, has now been recalled, listeners, believe it or not, to prison for having breached the terms of his release. Daniel, the BBC just continues to get itself mired in more scandal, more disaster, but continues to actually besmirch the great British community, as well as, obviously, our reputation abroad. Is it time for the licence fee to be scrapped?
Oh, absolutely. I think the BBC needs wholesale reform. I mean, we only have to look back 15 or so years when the stuff about Jimmy Savile started to come out, and then story after story after story about stars and inappropriate behaviour. Is it any wonder the BBC doesn't really have a clue with what it's doing, allowing music videos to be played from people who have killed and murdered on the streets of this country?
I think what scares me the most is that this person, whilst a teenager, ended up committing murder, and it didn't take long for them to be back on our streets. Surely murder is murder. If they're a teenager with a knife and they've killed another individual, they shouldn't be allowed out any time sooner than if they're an adult. This is why knife crime keeps happening on this country. Should be locking up these scumbags for longer.
Well, if they are old enough to pick up a knife and to plunge it into another human's flesh, then they're old enough to take the consequences. We shouldn't have this daft two-tier justice system where just because you're under the age of 18, you're let off for something that if you were over the age of 18, you'd be sentenced for life.
And obviously we had the chat about defence there, something that is a topic, and obviously you living in Staffordshire, the Staffordshire Regiment, obviously a lot of veterans, particularly those who served in Northern Ireland, will be living in the area. Are you concerned, and this is a failure I think on the Conservative Party as well as the Labour Party, that we've allowed the size of our forces to shrink, we've allowed the size of our Navy in particular, is what we were famous for, to almost disappear when it comes to actual naval frigates in the ocean, and we're undermining our security in a time when the world has never been so dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. But this has been the story since the 1980s. Defence spending hasn't been fit for purpose. We need to take the nuclear deterrent out of defence spending and ring-fence that, and the Treasury pays for that separately. Therefore, we'd actually have money to spend on our armed forces and actually thinking outside the box. I see they're talking about having a Dad's Army kind of style force as part of these leaked papers today from the Labour government. Well, in my opinion, if you're out of work and you're off work and you don't have a disability, why aren't you being drafted in to the military to fill the roles which are being left vacant across the Navy, Air Force and Army?
That we have plenty, as you say, we could be in our public services supporting, filling in potholes, working with the council, could be cleaning graffiti off our streets, picking up the litter in our community, serving in our armed forces, which is about discipline, which is about health and well-being, and is about having some routine. And I think for a lot of people that would be a real positive thing, and we should be, absolutely, I agree with you, looking at having schemes in place that are pushing people to help them get back into work, to help them get into a mental place where they're prepared to get back into work, rather than this welfare culture where more and more people are living off the state, which is adding further and further burden to an ever smaller pool of people, particularly younger people, when we've got an older population, listeners, which is something that concerns me, and a declining birth rate. This government, or any future government of any makeup, has to come up with policies and ideas to encourage families, encourage women and fathers to have more babies, to make sure we have a childcare system and a welfare system that supports that, because we need to be having more children. You've only got to look what's happening over in places like Japan and South Korea, where there is huge concern about the long-term impact of an ageing population that will do to the things. And Miriam Cates is a very fine voice on this particular issue. I encourage many people to go. Of course, another former colleague of mine, so of course I might be branded as biased there, but I think it's important. Now, Daniel, we've had 10 years of Keir Starmer. We've had 10 years of Keir Starmer. It feels like 10 years of Keir Starmer. He wants 10 years. This employers' national insurance, I've spoken on Talk exclusively that you've discovered that the grant that the government has given to Stoke-on-Trent City Council to allegedly cover the increase to employers' national insurance is actually short by £1 million. So the extra money that's come to allegedly fund extra services, millions are going to have to already come out of that, and that does not take into account the fact that children's social services, adult social services that you procure as a city council is going to need going to see increases in their costs, because those are private sector organisations that will not get any reimbursement from the council. What is going on with councils and their budgets? What are you seeing in Stoke-on-Trent?
Well, councils are still going bankrupt. The City Council in Stoke-on-Trent have asked for another £16.8 million bailout from the government because they don't have enough revenue coming in. Rachel Reeves said the public sector would be fully reimbursed for the national insurance increase. That was a lie, because Stoke-on-Trent hasn't been. We're £1 million short. That means the taxpayers of Stoke-on-Trent have to find £1 million to cover Labour's job tax. And it's not just Stoke Council, there's other councils up and down the country which are now being shortchanged by the Chancellor.
Well, I think you also found out this £16.8 million bailout is on top of the £40 million bailout from the previous year, and some of this bailout money is to pay the previous debt off from the former bailout. Am I not wrong?
No, it's correct. Out of the £16.8 million, there's £2.8 million worth of interest payments on last year's bailout that the council got from the government. So the government's bailing out previous bailouts and previous interest rates. It's totally and utterly mad, and it's happening up and down the countries.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a Labour government forcing more debt onto Labour councils, who are now having to claim more money from the government as a loan in order to pay other loans. This is the madness that we have in our society. I know it drives me potty in the potteries. I'm sure it's driving you potty wherever it is that you're driving or sitting or indeed watching us here on Talk. Please make sure you join in for the future hours. I'll be delighted to continue having Daniel join me in the studio for the remainder of the show. So make sure that you tune in to the home of common sense, which is at Talk. Call us on 0344 499 1000. Text the word Talk at the start of your message to 87222, and follow us on X at talkTV. I'll see you after this break.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, A up me ducks, you're joining us here on Talk, here, the home of Common Sense with me, Jonathan Gullis, former Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North and former Conservative Deputy Party Chairman, joined in the studio by Councillor Daniel Jellyman, the former Deputy Leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council and current Conservative Councillor. And just to make it clear, obviously Daniel's highlighted some quite interesting and shocking statistics and facts. We are indeed going to make sure that the Labour Council has a right to reply, and if they want to call in to the show now to have their say, call in at 0344 499 1000. They'll be put through straight away. Councillor Jane Ashworth, the phone line is available for you anytime soon. And I just want to quickly get to some breaking news. First of all, Kate Vince, the ex-wife of green energy industrialist Dale Vince, a big funder of the Labour Party, a former funder of Just Stop Oil, has been awarded more than £40 million by a High Court judge following their divorce. And other breaking news, Donald Trump's inauguration could be moving indoors due to weather and security. If we get any more, we'll make sure we'll be bringing it to you here on the home of Common Sense, which is at Talk. But I want to get to a topic that I know has had many of you wound up over a number of weeks. It is emotionally charged, but actually is vitally important. I'm delighted to have Dr. Rakib Hassan joining us here on the home of Common Sense, a man who has been making a lot of noise for a long time about this important issue and sadly has been ignored, I think, for far too long by the establishment, and we're delighted to have him join us here on Talk. Dr. Rakib, thank you so much for joining us today. Can I get your reaction, first of all, to Yvette Cooper, Labour's government's so-called local inquiries, and whether or not you think they are enough?
Well, in my view, Jonathan, completely insufficient. What we need a proper national public investigation into what I call group localised child sexual exploitation, which in more informal terms is street-based grooming by organised networks. And the announcement made by the Home Secretary yesterday in the House of Commons falls well short of that. She talks about 5 local inquiries and a snap national audit, which would be carried out by Dame Louise Casey over a period of only 3 months. And for me, that just isn't going to cut it. And also, I believe that these local inquiries, they won't have statutory powers. So they won't have the power to compel witnesses to attend and to take evidence under oath. So for me, what you need is a national public inquiry that explores the cultural, economic and social drivers of that street-based grooming, but crucially is able to compel witnesses to attend in order to determine public sector accountability for blatant institutional failures, which ultimately led to the most vulnerable members of society being severely let down by various organs of the British state.
I think you've, in one of your articles in The Spectator, really used some great words. For example, you've talked about how this is a toothless announcement from the government, the fact that there is a risk that potentially compromised public institutions could ultimately be marking their own homework. As you've said, this scandal is not just about the victims and those who committed these horrific crimes. It's about the cover-up. It's about the institutions that failed these girls over and over again. And I don't think this government has understood that's what the public are most angry about right now.
No, absolutely. And I think that what we need is a proper national public investigation, a statutory inquiry, which really looks at those very important matters of accountability, holding people responsible for those blatant institutional failures. So that would include local councils, police forces, social services. And I think you also need to look at the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts if we want to look at whether appropriate justice has been delivered for the victims and survivors of these heinous crimes.
I actually was dealing with, as a Member of Parliament, a particular case localised of a girl called Jodie who sadly lost her own life and was dealing with her mother, and the case is just simply horrific. A young lady who was being interviewed now by Sammy Woodhouse, who was raped, who ended up giving birth to a son of hers. the rapist that is part of one of these grooming gangs. And I worked very hard with the then editor Mark Waddington of the Stoke Sentinel to try and expose the name of the individual using parliamentary privilege who committed this awful crime. And the fact that places like Stoke-on-Trent are not even named in one of the lists of these 50 towns, yet in numerous reports that have been written, Stoke-on-Trent is somewhere that's seen to be a hotbed of activity. As you say, are you concerned that we've got this list of 50, we're only actually having an inquiry into 5, but this goes well beyond the list? This is infecting many parts of our United Kingdom.
No, absolutely. For me, this kind of street-based grooming by what I consider to be predatory enterprises, this is a nationwide problem, which is precisely why 5 local inquiries, without having those statutory powers, for me, it falls well short of the proper national public investigation that we need. And I think that there's certain announcements made by the Home Secretary yesterday which are to be welcomed. I think enacting the recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, that can be welcomed. The fact that this SNAP audit will look into the cultural and societal drivers of street-based grooming, I think that is important, because we do have academic papers which show that when it comes to that group localized child sexual exploitation that we're referring to, it's men of Pakistani Muslim heritage which tend to dominate the prosecutions. So I think we need to look at those cultural and societal drivers. But I think what we need is an in-depth nationwide investigation. And I have to say, I think the issue with the local inquiries is that you may have public institutions who are ultimately marking their own homework. So I think it falls well short of having those rigorous independent investigations that we need to see.
One of the points you just raised there is obviously the fact that in terms of prosecutions, British Pakistanis are indeed heavily populated within those statistics. There are people, particularly on the left, I found, who have actively messaged me on social media to say, actually, wait a second, 83% of the offenders are white in these type of cases. Why is it that this is being turned into a racial or ethnicity or indeed cultural issue? Do you think that's just muddying the waters? Do you think there is a specific problem within the British Pakistani community, or is actually just that they're overly represented, but there's many other people who have so far walked free that come from other ethnic backgrounds that should indeed also be seeing their day in court?
Well, I think it's certainly problematic to frame this as a Pakistani problem. Now, for example, how many white-collar Pakistani origin professionals are involved in street-based grooming? So I think that also you have to talk about those socioeconomic dynamics as well. What we're talking about here is that there tends to be a high level of representation among those who operate within what I consider to be a very intense, clannish kingship networks, which operate in very segregated, under-regulated parts of the nighttime economy. So I think the economics is important as well. But I think that that's the whole point. I think that if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you need a national public investigation, which looks far beyond just 5 areas looking at that. And I think there's something that gets overlooked a great deal, is that when you look at this kind of grooming gang activity, Jonathan, it's taken place within Asian Muslim communities, that you actually have victims of Asian Muslim origin as well. So I think that what you want to see a national public inquiry that delivers justice for those victims who may be from a variety of backgrounds. But I think in cases where, in places such as Rotherham and Telford, for example, where the victims were predominantly white British working class girls, I want to see those public institutions investigated to see, are there class-based prejudices? Were these girls ultimately seen as worthless, not deserving of protection? And I think there has to be that debate on whether these institutions were paralysed by racial and religious sensitivities. Were there public sector officials who were worried about rocking the multicultural boat and looking to preserve community relations by investigating these cases of grooming gang abuse and exploitation? So all these things need to be investigated. And I think, can you truly do that with just 5 local inquiries and a SNAP national audit? I'm not so sure.
I think you made a great point there about the fact that class should be looked into this, because when I was on the Education Select Committee in Parliament, we looked at the fact that educational outcomes were worst for white British boys and girls who are on free school meals and their other competitors from other ethnic groups apart from Roma Gypsy. Yet if you look at all the type of schemes and opportunities, whether that be apprenticeships, internships, work experience, or indeed access to the top universities, these schemes are aimed at more people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And I think, therefore, there has been an element of classism in this, as well as an element of, like you say, not rocking the multicultural boat. And actually what upsets me the most is that multiculturalism is undermined by those trying to, I don't know, on some perversion, protect it in this perverse way, rather than actually talking about we need to hold people to account, we need to act within the law, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity, or indeed gender. This is how we get to the bottom of scandals. This is how we avoid harm being done. Can I ask you, Dr. Rakib, you're an expert in this area. You've been talking for a long time in this area. You've obviously done a lot of work in it as well. Has the government come to you? Has the Labour Party reached out to you to ask for your advice and your expertise? Because surely, again, if they're looking for a bit of breathing space, they would be using voices such as yours to have a say.
Well, even though, Jonathan, I'm a traditional Labour voter, and one of the first things I did when I gained full-time employment was join a trade union, I can tell you now that the Labour Party hasn't reached out to me. And I think that it's really important that you make this point about underprivilege within white British left behind communities, deindustrialised communities. And I think that the real problem here for many people on the left, that they just can't comprehend and get to grips with group localised child sexual exploitation, is because it undercuts those theories of white privilege, and also it ultimately undermines their worldview of minorities being oppressed. Because I think it's very clear that in many of these grooming gang cases, who are the victims and ultimately who are the exploitative oppressors? And I think they simply can't get to grips with that, and they just can't face up to the reality.
Dr. Rakib, can I say thank you so much for joining us, being such a voice of common sense. And if the Labour Party won't, I certainly hope the party I'm a member of, the Conservative Party leadership, will reach out to you to get your voice, your opinions, your ideas, because we need to be listening to people who know what they're talking about, not assuming that Westminster always has the answers. There is a caller here, Kevin from Portsmouth, who is rung in very passionately about this issue. Kevin, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Jonathan. Good evening to you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Please tell me what you think about these grooming gangs.
Well, I'm reading a book by a woman called Jane Senior. She was a youth worker in Rotherham, end of the 90s, early noughties. It was going on then. It was prolific then. The cover-ups were from the police, social workers, counsellors, the lot. This is nothing new. One of the girls she was helping picked up by a guy slightly older than she. I think she's 13, 14, something like that. Picked up by a 15, 16-year-old. It's kind of not unreasonable. He then introduced her to older people, introduced her to a married man. She thought this is the love of her life. It was all going fine. It didn't. She threatened to expose the married man to his family, and she ended up dead. And she was found in a canal. What they'd done is they stabbed her in the head, just enough to be really painful, keep her conscious, and then chucked her in the canal to drown. Okay? Now, this is nothing new. The rape stuff is absolutely horrendous, but it gets much, much, much worse than that. These guys are linked to organised crime, with drugs, drug running, all sorts of stuff. And Jane Senior was completely shut down. If you haven't read it, get her book, Broken and Betrayed. It is absolutely horrifying.
Thank you, Kevin, for your call, and thank you for the plugging of that book. I think it's an important read for all of us. Daniel, again, if I can come to you quickly to make the point that you can repeat again, please. Why are localised inquiries not going to work? Why do we need a national inquiry? Someone who is a member of a local council.
Because these incidences of grooming and child exploitation and these gangs are cross-boundary issues. They don't end at a council's border. They don't end in Rotherham. They don't end in Oldham. They are transported across county lines. It needs a national inquiry because it's a national problem, and Labour's just brushing it underneath the carpet by saying we'll have these local reviews. It needs a national inquiry to get to the bottom of it.
I find it baffling that the Labour government are dying on this hill when they could easily win just a lot of plaudits by saying, you know what, we got this wrong, let's have the national inquiry, let's look into it, let's get the answers the victims deserve. And you don't need 7 years to do that. You could put a time limit of 2 to 3 years and then have a real clear set of policies leading into the next election of what it is that you would do if you were in government. We're going to go to a quick break. Remember to call us here at Talk at 0344 49 1000. Text in the word talk to 87222 and message us on X at talkTV. You're joining me, Jonathan Gullis, here on Drive Time at the home of common sense on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here on Talk, the home of common sense, joined by me, Jonathan Gullis, former Conservative Member of Parliament and former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. Delighted to be stepping in here to cover Drive Time. We've had amazing calls, amazing messages and amazing guests so far. And let's get to a few of those messages. I've got one from, they've put TF, so don't know the name, but it says, "Hi Jonathan, you have Conservative values and you're a very passionate man. Please join Reform. I know you said you wouldn't because you're a Conservative through and through, but Reform need Conservative thinking people like you. You have a great voice for the people of this country. Please defect for the sake of our country." I'm sorry to TF to break your heart on air, but I won't be defecting. I will be fighting for those Conservative values in the heart of the Conservative Party. We had another one from Jackie, who is an Oldham resident, who has said, "Yvette Cooper's proposals are an insult to the survivors. The claims of cover-ups in Oldham have been acknowledged by Maggie Oliver. All institutions are implicated, as are senior Labour MPs, which is why we'll never get a public inquiry in my town." Some serious accusations there, of course. Let's not forget that the local government minister is Jim McCone, who was indeed actually, I think, the leader at one stage of Oldham Council. There has been a lot of talk about whether or not he is someone who will have questions to answer. Of course, he will say, fairly so, that he acted appropriately and allowed all the authorities and alerted them at all times. And I'm not trying to infer anything at all. But, of course, he has, I think, got to really look at what's happening in Oldham and look at his time and see if there was anyone hiding anything from him when he was in charge of the local authority. And then we've got another one here. Starmer is never going to sack Hermer. Hermer is Lord Hermer. He is the Attorney General for the government. He was the one who I was talking about acting previously as a lawyer for Jerry Adams and earning, I think, to the tune, the Times is reporting, £30,000. And of course, legislation has now been revoked. The legislation to end vexatious claims against veterans of the British Armed Forces, which will also, by the way, allow compensation given to those who serve time in prison, including Jerry Adams, for links allegedly with the IRA or activities that were undertaken under the premise of the IRA. Never in history, the message continues, has a government turned so squalid and shown nepotism on such an industrial scale so quickly. I can't disagree with that. But we're going to a couple of callers first. We've got Jay through from Essex, who wants to tell us about her feelings on Keir Starmer having been Prime Minister so far and whether or not she's excited for 10 years of Starmerism. Hey, Jay.
Hello, Jonathan. No, I'm not excited. I'm absolutely livid. I saw the headline and I actually couldn't believe it. Who the hell does this bloke think he is? They got elected on lies and they should be kicked out on that alone. They're ruining the country. They're morally corrupt and financially really incompetent. The Prime Minister and the government are only caretakers of this country for the 5 years that they're voted in for, and they only get voted back in if they do a good job. And they need to realise they work for us, the people. You've got important things like the grooming gangs, law and order, immigration, NHS, WASPI, the Chagos Islands, this new deal 100 years with Ukraine, the farmers, the winter fuel allowance. Why is he messing around with banning free speech in pubs and things like that? For Christ's sake, can they stop farting around and prioritise on sorting this country out?
Jay, you need to run for Parliament because we need more common sense voices like this. I tell you, I've been in that building. I've seen the nonsensical views of people, by the way, on both sides of the chamber and the detachment from reality. You're very right in saying that we've had, what, free gear care, £30,000 in suits and glasses, free tickets to Taylor Swift and to football matches in the luxury VIP boxes. Then we had, obviously, two-tier care, where, rightly, some people were prosecuted for saying dreadful things on social media, but did they need to go to prison for 18 months when you could have just fined them or made them do community service instead, rather than seeing people like Hugh Edwards end up in prison, albeit, obviously, Keir Starmer was not directly responsible for that prosecution, but the legal system failing to see someone like Hugh Edwards, who's admitted to paedophilia, ending up behind bars. And then we've got Never Hear Keir, because he's so constantly jet-setting around the world, getting photos for his album of the future to show his family, his children, his grandchildren, of what a cool guy he was on the world stage with cool people like Justin Trudeau, who I'm delighted to see the back of very shortly, although Mark Carney, God help us if he gets in charge of Canada. Pierre Poilievre can't become Prime Minister soon enough. But as you say, we've got a Prime Minister who's more busy involved jet-setting around the world rather than standing up for the British people and tackling the issues of the day, giving billions in overseas aid for climate change, giving millions in overseas to foreign farmers whilst undermining British farming by introducing the inheritance tax that he promised he wouldn't do, axing winter fuel payments for our pensioners, handing over our sovereign territory to the tune of £9 billion to people who are the friends of the Chinese Communist Party who are committing horrific genocide, and getting into spats with Elon Musk rather than calling out China's genocide, which is obviously, let's not forget, running TikTok at the end of the day as well. I'm sure you can understand that feeling there. Now, Jay, thank you so much for calling in. We're quickly going to go to my next story, which I think is an important one and a shocking one, I think it's fair to say, at that. We're going to be joined now by Councillor Thomas Kerr. He was the Conservative group leader on Glasgow City Council, an area I know well because I have in-laws based in Paisley, just over the road, and was up there recently. In fact, one of my best friends, he won't like me admitting it, is David Linden, the former Scottish National Member of Parliament for the Glasgow area. And now Thomas has defected from the Conservatives to join Reform UK. This is sending shockwaves around the establishment. This is following high-profile defections from people like Dame Andrea Jenkins and Marco Longhi, former Conservative members of Parliament. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the show. May I ask, what is it that led you to thinking that the Conservatives no longer could have your membership and that you felt that Reform UK were the answer to the people of Glasgow?
Well, I've been feeling a bit scunnered with the party for a wee while, Jonathan, now, especially after the general election. I feel like areas that I represent in the East End of Glasgow. I mean, you mentioned David Linden. David Linden was actually my opponent in the general election. So areas that David represented in Glasgow East, I think that our party had turned its back on for a long time, which is where my council seat was. And I had many fights inside the party saying how our strategy had to change, how we had to focus in working class areas like where you had won in the Red Wall. And I was coming up against a brick wall, and I've been in the Conservative Party for 14 years. I joined when I was 14 years old, and I've been there for a long time. And I felt as if I'd had enough. So I had took some time over Christmas, spoke to family, spoke to friends, spoke to loved ones about what I was going to do politically. And then I started to look at reform, and I thought, actually, this is offering the change that I think my constituents need. So I reached out, spoke to people, and decided, actually, I'm going to take a leap of faith here. The easy thing for me would have been to turn around and say, I'm going to not rock the boat and be nice. But actually, I thought I need to put my constituents first, which is why I made the decision that I done yesterday.
Thomas, may I ask you, and this is, by the way, not a judgment on you, because I'm going to be very clear with people here. Unlike other former colleagues of mine who are quick to denigrate and talk down to people like yourself, Thomas, who have made that decision, I'm not going to do that, because it's the fault of my party to fail to deliver, to fail to connect, to fail to cherish and nurture our members, our councillors, that has led to some people making the decision to join Reform UK. Reform UK exists because the Conservative Party let down the people at the end of the day. So it's we who should be angry with ourselves. I'm certainly angry with the Conservative Party, and I don't blame anyone for thinking that Reform UK may be the answer. Even if I disagree with that, I don't blame them for thinking that. May I ask you, Kemi Badenoch, though, has only been in charge for 10 weeks. Some people would say you haven't given her a fair enough shot to prove that she's going to take the Conservative Party back in the direction that you and I would want to see it in. Would that be a fair assessment, or sadly do you think Kemi just doesn't have the answers?
I voted for Kemi. I had high hopes for Kemi. I've sadly been let down by Kemi. But we have systematic issues in Scotland with the party as well. It's not just about what's going on down south. Obviously in Scotland we are an autonomous party, and the direction of the Scottish Conservatives over the past number of years has not been going in the right direction. We've focused a strategy on to beat the SNP and been very negative. We've focused on key seats and not in the central belt of Scotland and not in the vast majority of the population. And I've made many arguments inside my party that actually the forgotten communities in Glasgow, many of which exist in England as well, have been let down by establishment parties. In Glasgow, it was Labour and the SNP for generations. And we had a unique opportunity in 2017 onwards with Ruth Davidson to make a change, and actually the party squandered all that opportunity. So, as I said, the easy option for me would have been to turn around and say, I'm not going to rock the boat, I'll stay with my former colleagues. As I say, 14 years I've been in the Conservative Party. This wasn't an easy decision for me at all my friends. It was another family to me, but I felt like I had to put my constituents first. So sadly, I don't think Kemi is cutting it through to the public, and I actually think that the problem is the party behind Kemi and Russell Findlay in Scotland is broken entirely, and they won't let the changes that I think the country needs come through.
I agree with you. I'm very concerned about those behind the scenes. I think Kemi has the right, is saying the right things publicly and has the right ideas. Whether or not the party will be allow her to impose the changes is something that I'm deeply concerned by too.
And that's one of the big things we have in Scotland. Russell Findlay, who's our leader in Scotland, has only been there for a couple of months. He's a very nice guy. The problem is behind the scenes, the people who run the party have been the same people for the past 20 years, and they will not let the changes that I think the party fundamentally needs to be able to champion working class Scotland happen, which meant I could stay in the party and I could be doing it for another 20 years and hit my head off the brick wall, or I could take a leap of faith here and do what I think is best for the people of Glasgow. And that's what I done yesterday.
What I will say, Thomas, is the area that you represent and the community of Glasgow, which, as I say, I'm fortunate to know more than I should because obviously of my in-laws, is incredibly hard and incredibly impressive for a Conservative to get elected. I'm very sad to see that you feel that the Conservative Party can no longer represent your values. Now, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about defections. Do you think we'll see other Conservative councillors in other parts of Scotland, or if indeed locally, as well as maybe members of the Scottish Parliament potentially defect? A lot of polls are showing that actually Reform UK are ahead of the Conservatives in Scotland, which I think will shock many in national vote share. And there's a lot of talk that they could see 6 to 8 MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, elected in 2026. And Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef have made it perfectly clear that they're coming for every region, every part of our nation. Do you expect to see more Scottish Conservatives in elected positions to follow you, or do you think that we'll see a pause until those elections in 2026?
No, I wouldn't be surprised. I think that I may be the start of what may be things to come. I don't think it'll just come from the Conservatives, Jonathan. I think there'll be people from the Labour Party as well in Scotland. I've spoken to a number of colleagues over the past 48 hours who were amazed at what I had done, but who are now seriously thinking about it themselves. What I've said to every single person, though, is it took me a lot of soul searching to come to the decision that I made. I know how difficult it was for me, so I would never tell any colleague what I think they should or should not do. What I've said to them is cut out the noise, cut out the media, focus on what you think is best for your constituents and come to that. I think they will come to the decision organically throughout the Central Belt. And as I said, I don't think it will be just Conservatives. I think there'll be people from the Labour Party and from across the political spectrum who'll say, we're sick, fed up, and it's time for something different and time for real change.
I'm a big believer there's an awful lot of complacency within the Conservative Party towards Reform UK right now, and I say particularly the Parliamentary Party, who simply are sitting back and hoping that maybe there'll be an implosion within Reform UK, maybe the vote, and assuming the voters, because they're so angry at Labour, will just come back to us. I think that is so misguided. I think the voters are so angry still at us as much as they are at the Labour Party, and that to win back trust is going to be a monumental challenge, and that Reform UK are here to stay. People forget UKIP was around for around 15 plus years. They did not disappear overnight. Reform UK are certainly here to play, in the Conservative Party. If they're not mentally prepared for the reality of potentially being the opposition, or even seeing Reform UK as the opposition, or indeed leading the Senedd in Wales, if they're not prepared for 6 to 8 at least members of the Scottish Parliament, and not prepared to see maybe a mayor in Dame Andrea Jenkins and 300 plus councillors, if they're not mentally prepared for the reality the voters are going to send us a message that we still have a long way to go, then I think the Conservative Party's future is existential at that point, and it's inevitable that some kind of pressure for a deal will come. I'd rather not see that come, and I certainly hope, Thomas, that in the future the Conservative Party can win back your trust, and I certainly hope the Conservative Party would welcome you back in with open arms, because I would like to see you back here where I think your natural home would be, albeit understand the challenges and the disappointment that you felt, and I'm sorry that it got to that point. But thank you so much for joining us and for showing us that news. Daniel, we are in Staffordshire are going to see county council elections. We're not one of the local authority areas that have applied for a cancellation. Do you think we're going to see defections to Reform UK? Do you think Reform can make a wave in Staffordshire?
Well, one of the Conservative candidates in Staffordshire has already defected to Reform. No doubt there might be others in the future as well, but it's very sad to see Thomas, who's obviously worked incredibly hard over 14 years, to get elected in a place like Glasgow that had 2 Conservative councillors, while places like Manchester has none. For the party to lose such a talent is bad news, and the Conservative Party needs to wake up. CCHQ needs to wake up. We can't be complacent. The people out there are angry with the establishment. They're angry with the mainstream parties, and they want to have a change, and they want things to be radically shook up. And the Conservative Party should seize that agenda instead of sitting there and hoping for Labour to fall apart and Reform to be pulled apart. The Tory party has forgotten what happened to the Liberal Party at the end of the Great War, where they were outflanked on the left by the Labour Party, and the Tory party risks that happening today, but Reform on the right.
Thank you so much for that analysis, Dan. It's going to be a huge challenge. Chancellor Daniel Jellyman, obviously, let's not forget, councillor at Stoke-on-Trent City Council, former deputy leader and a member of the Conservative Party. We're going to take a quick break. Remember to keep those calls in. The switchboard is lighting up. The texts are going furious. The team behind the screen is telling me lots of good things in my ears. I'm listening to what our guests have to say. Join us by calling us on 0344 499 1000. Text in with the word TALK to 87222 and follow us on X at talkTV.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here, the home of common sense at Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis, former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, former Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North, joined in the studio by Councillor Daniel Jellyman from Stoke-on-Trent City Council, former Deputy Leader of the City Council as well. And we've been talking, obviously, all things national and local and giving you some great exclusives around particularly local government finance. And again, Councillor Jane Ashworth, Leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council, Labour Councillor, we're keen to get your views. And if anyone in the communications team of Stoke-on-Trent City Council is listening, you can let us know what we have to say, obviously, about some of the fact that the money is simply not there, that you're having to borrow to pay for previous debt, interest rates, and obviously you have a shortfall in your budget when it comes to the national insurance. Now, there has been some breaking news in the past hour, which I think is important. So according to reports on the ceasefire agreement, the first hostages will be released on Sunday. Israel will release Palestinian prisoners in return. So this is important following a meeting of the Israeli cabinet. So there's the sort of war cabinet that's agreed for this deal to go to the wider cabinet of the Israeli government that seems to have now approved, and hopefully those hostages will be back in the arms of their families and loved ones sooner rather than later. And remember the cost of the Israelis, the prisoners that are being released, in the tens to hundreds in order for that deal to go ahead. An important breaking news story. Now, the next story that I want to talk about is the fact that Sadiq Khan, yes, Sir Sadiq, although I refuse to call him that any longer, is now being investigated following £3,000 worth of free Taylor Swift tickets. And this has been because the London Assembly member, Conservative London Assembly member Susan Hall, has been writing to the Ethics Commissioner to call out Sadiq's freebies. And she joins me now, Susan Hall, on the line. Hello, Susan, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to see you again, as always, and delighted that you're holding this terrible mayor to account. Susan, do you want to tell us what it is that he's being looked into, what the Ethics Commissioner has certainly questioned when it comes to these Taylor Swift tickets that you've unearthed?
Well, I put in a complaint that, first of all, he declared the tickets 10 days late. He also originally declared them to be much cheaper than they were. And apparently they came from an organisation that was unknown to the mayor. And of course, he does know the organisation because they've got contracts with City Hall. So I've put in a complaint and they are now looking into whether it was wise that he took the tickets. So because they're looking into this, I can't discuss that much further until I hear. But, you know, we have to have certain standards in public life. And Sadiq Khan just runs roughshod over everybody. So it was right that I put in a complaint, and we'll see what happens from here.
Is this the first time Sadiq Khan's been looked into during his time as mayor, or have there been other examples where you certainly have raised questions and it's been probed and looked at to see whether or not he was following the rules?
Well, I'd certainly put in complaints about the Chris Carver case. If you recall,
absolutely,
that gentleman was shot. And then completely incorrectly, Sadiq Khan immediately took the side of the gentleman that had been shot, not stayed completely neutral, which he should have done because he's the Police and Crime Commissioner. And then, of course, that poor police officer had his name out there for everybody. And then when it came to it being looked into, then he was let off completely by a jury within less than 3 hours. And yet in the meantime, all Sadiq Khan had said, oh, this poor young man, you know, with a family, and he should have just stayed completely neutral. So I did put in complaints about that. I put in quite a few complaints over the years. I've been there a while.
Well, I don't blame you, Susan. I was absolutely disgusted when that went in, because when I was serving as Member of Parliament, Staffordshire Police were telling me that in Staffordshire, armed officers were handing in their weapons, handing in their badges because of what happened in that particular case. And to see an elected politician, as you say, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, to so quickly come to an assumption, to desperately almost try and have, let's be frank, their George Floyd moment, which is what he was looking for, and then to end up having a tweet that would have undoubtedly encouraged others to send abuse and death threats in some way or other towards that police officer who was just undertaking their duty in the line of keeping other Londoners safe. And then for Sadiq Khan, when the trial, as you say, came to a conclusion that rightly the police officer was found not guilty and cleared of any charges, then tried to jump on some bandwagon and say that he was glad to see that the officer was let off. The trust being undermined in our police force, particularly the London Metropolitan Service, must be extraordinary. Has there been an impact when it comes to armed officers who are choosing no longer to take up their weapons and keep our streets safe because of the actions of the mayor and this particular case?
Well, it would be hard to prove, but yes, if you talk privately to police officers, they're not happy at all. They expect to be backed up when they are doing their job. If they do something that's wrong, and we know the cases where things have gone wrong, yes, throw the book at them. But in the meantime, support those officers, because by God, we need them, especially the armed officers. I mean, they deal with an awful lot more than people realise. I went out on a night shift with one section of those armed officers, and I can tell you, we were tearing around London where somebody had been shot, and then there was somebody else that had been seen with guns, etc. I don't think the public know just how wonderful these officers are. Yes, they get things wrong and then they have to be taken into account. But in the meantime, for God's sake, start supporting our police officers.
Well, when it comes to policing the streets of London, there's a video clip that's gone viral of one of your Assembly members, Reform UK Assembly member Alex Wilson, had an exchange with the London Mayor Sadiq Khan about knife crime and about police. Let's just quickly take a listen.
My team has been working on a budget amendment where we would like to fund almost 1,000 police officers to deliver a targeted knife crime task force. And the way we do this is reduce the cost of your staff budget back to 2016 levels. That will give us the funding to do this. Now, obviously, I can't table that as a budget amendment on my own. I need support from other groups. Would you encourage members of other groups, perhaps your own group in the Labour Party, perhaps the Conservatives, perhaps anybody, to second that amendment so that it can be discussed and debated in full next week at the budget meeting?
As a rule of thumb, I never encourage anyone to work with Reform.
So that's a clear no. So this is a really important issue, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, the figures quoted in the police and crime plan show that 70% of Londoners rank tackling knife and gun crime as one of their top priorities for London. You talked about cross-party working. I think that's it's a question of priorities. You've shown what your priority is. I'm showing what my priority is. I really, really hope that other members present, perhaps will have a more constructive conversation with me. Thank you.
Now, Susan, I'm repulsed that Sadiq Khan would put party politics ahead of the safety of Londoners, as you say, when he is the Met Police and Crime Commissioner. I know that you've faced his disgusting attitude many times, particularly when you're running as his opponent for the Mayor of London, and the way he spoke to you, I thought at times was repulsive and repugnant from what I saw on social media clips. Now, Alex Wilson, I think, has come up with a good idea. Will you back it? Will you second that amendment so we can have that vote at the GLA?
It doesn't quite work like that. We will be doing our own amendment. Let me tell you, I've been holding the Mayor to account on police figures for a long time. And in the last draft budget, we are due to lose 2,300 police officers from the streets of London. Now, there's been another one just come through yesterday. I haven't had time to read it all through properly, which has put some more money in there, but I think we'll still be losing 1,700 police officers. London cannot afford to lose any more police officers. Sadiq Khan doesn't listen. You saw how he treated Alex at the end of that clip. That's how he treats me all the time. I don't know if you've seen the video that went viral yesterday of me actually saying, do we have any of these rape gangs in London? And he just kept putting the answer on. I don't know what you mean, he kept saying. What exactly are you saying? And I am saying, do we actually have any of these gangs in London? He's the Police and Crime Commissioner. He should answer a question like that from me. And if any of you have seen that particular clip, he just kept changing the subject or saying, what exactly do you mean? Well, if he doesn't know what I mean, then he shouldn't be the Police and Crime Commissioner. And as Police and Crime Commissioner, he should certainly have asked the Met Police if there are any of those grooming gangs or rape gangs in London, because I'm hard pushed to think that there aren't. And if there are, we need to be dealing with it.
But can I just push back a little bit here, Susan? If Alex Wilson has what seems to be a very sensible amendment in the interests of Londoners, and I know you care, by the way, I know that you will generally work with across the House, would it not make sense for Conservatives and Reform in this case to work together on an amendment. It doesn't matter who gets the credit, it doesn't matter who's come up with the idea, but as long as we're putting the safety of Londoners first, that would be better than allowing this ridiculous mayor, as you say, to pretend somehow, it seems, that he doesn't understand what rape gangs are and care more about telling people not to talk to Reform UK than putting 1,000 more coppers on the street to keep Londoners safe. Would that not be in the interest of Conservatives and Reform to work together proactively in this case to get rid of and hold to account this disastrous mayor?
Every year we put forward an amendment, and I think virtually every year, or certainly most years, it's been to put more police on our streets. It is totally ignored. The Conservatives will, as always, do a fully costed amendment because that's what we do. And to get them fully costed is difficult because they have to go through all the account system. It's far more difficult than you would think. You don't just say, this is what we want to do and we'll do it, because there are so many variables in that. We are working at the moment on an amendment and we'll see how that goes. So I can't comment on that. It's also not my decision. It'd be a group decision. But we will definitely, I mean, nearly every year we have done it to put more police officers on the street, because you and I both know that's what London needs more than anything, not less. And at the moment, his budget gives us 1,700 less police officers on our streets.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your work to the community of London and, of course, where you're a councillor in Harrow. Thank you so much for continuing to hold this terrible mayor to account. We're going to have a short break. Remember, call us on 0344 499 1000. Text the word TALK to 87222. Maybe you want to tell me Sadiq Khan is a great mayor. I would love to read out, and I promise you, if I see that, I'll read out that message. It'll be the first one I've ever seen, but I'll read it. And make sure you follow us on X at talkTV.
Sleepy Joe Biden proved to everyone that he has what it takes to be president. So now we have a new victim to defeat, Kamala Harris, L-Y-I-N apostrophe. Take a look at what happened. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. Many people have told me that God spared my life for a reason.
Across the UK, on DAB+, On your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to here, the home of common sense at Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis. Delighted to have you joining us. And in the studio, we've got Councillor Daniel Gentleman from Stoke-on-Trent City Council, who I know is not necessarily the biggest football fan, so he'll be spared because it's now time for our Talk Sport update.
Sport Summary on Talk.
I'm delighted to be joined by Talk Sport presenter Uma Gurav. It's great to have you on, Uma. How are you doing?
Great. It's been a very busy day over at TalkSport because it is actually TalkSport's 25th birthday today.
Woo!
So, yeah, it's been a big day of celebration. Everyone's reflecting on the best moments from TalkSport. So, yeah, really fun day.
I know that we're the same parent company, but I must confess I'm a huge TalkSport fan. It was what got me to school when I was driving in the mornings and on the way home, keeping me. I used to love Adrian and Darren on Drive Time. I think that your presenters now at Drive Time are brilliant as well. Andy Goldstein and Darren Bent, obviously a former Fulham player who I'm going to be biased about because, of course, the big game really, Uma, let's be honest, it's not Arsenal versus Aston Villa tomorrow. It's actually Fulham versus Leicester. That's the big game of the weekend that everyone needs to tune into, right?
Oh, absolutely, of course. And we'll have updates on that, the game of the weekend on TalkSport, but we'll also be keeping you across the less important games, of course, as well, like Newcastle versus Bournemouth and West Ham versus Crystal Palace. But as you say, yeah, Fulham doing pretty well this season, though.
I'm a big believer that Marco Silva is often overlooked, and I think that Fulham would be in a much worse position because it doesn't actually have, in my opinion, a very strong squad. It's the manager that's overperforming with a team that I think would underperform otherwise, and I think that if we can hold on to Marco Silva any longer, it will be a miracle. And but any other Premier team listening, I have a bad track record. When I back Tory leaders, they tend to not win the leadership contest, so don't take my advice on managerial appointments anytime soon. But look, Uma, the big news today is that Erling Haaland, the Manchester City striker, has just signed a 9.5-year deal to 2034. There was a great video on their social media, I saw, Man City, where he was writing a letter to defenders to say he was sorry, but he's hanging around for a little while longer. What details do we know about this deal, and do you think this is massive news for Manchester City?
Yeah, you do sort of get a sense of every single defender in the Premier League crying now. Erling Haaland is going to be staying at Manchester City. The deal does take us through to 2034, by which point he will be 34 years old. But, you know, we're used to Erling Haaland breaking records on the pitch, but this is a record-long contract in the Premier League. He overtakes Cole Palmer's contract. He's going to be paid £500,000 a week on this contract. But if you remember, you know, a couple of years ago, there was this petition that was signed trying to prove that Erling Haaland was a robot. And when you look at some of his figures, his goal-scoring figures, you think, yeah, actually, when you have somebody who can do that kind of thing on the pitch, this is such good news for Manchester City. And also tells us a little bit about these 115 charges that they're facing, which everyone keeps talking about. Kind of jokes that Manchester City might be relegated all the way down to League Two, but this is an indication that Man City are confident they're going to be staying in the Premier League and that they're now going to hold on to probably the best striker of our generation at the moment. So great news for them.
I'll tell you what, if God forbid Man City got relegated to League Two, my beloved local team Port Vale Football Club will be in for all sorts of trouble if they have to come up against him. So let's hope that the Manchester City stay in the Premier League. But it is an incredible deal, and £500,000 a week isn't bad if you can get it. Does that include, by the way, sort of sponsorship deals, or is that just, as we understand, the base salary that Manchester City's paying?
That's just his base salary, so that doesn't include any advertising deals, any photo deals, anything that he does on top of it. And, you know, but once you get to that kind of money, you're just thinking, oh my gosh. And the thing is, Erling Haaland is the kind of player who, regardless of how much he's getting paid, he's so motivated by scoring and just impressing on the pitch. We know how angry he gets when he doesn't score in a game, even if Manchester City wins. So you sort of think it doesn't really matter how much they're paying him. He's going to be smashing it out there no matter what.
Erling, if you're listening, if you need someone to chauffeur you around, Stoke's just down the road from Manchester, you need someone to go out and get your grocery shoppings or just indeed give the house a bit of a spring clean, I'm ready and available to come and help for a nominal fee next to your £500,000 a week salary, just so you're aware. The other big news is that Jack Draper, now this is a name I keep hearing. I've got to be honest, I got into tennis because of Andy Murray. I was that generation and I've sort of lost Jack. But Jack Draper's name's really coming up time and time again. I believe he's the number one player for the men's in the United Kingdom. He's going to meet Carlos Alcaraz, who's sort of the future star, the future Federer, Nadal and Djokovic put together, it seems, by the way he's packaged, in the Australian Open after beating Alexander Vukic in another 5-set thriller. Do you think Jack Draper could pull off an upset here, or do you think that Carlos Alcaraz is just one step too far?
It'd be really hard for Jack Draper, that is for sure. But obviously, if you think back to how he kind of captured all our hearts at the US Open, making it to the Final Four last year, it's that mentality that he's got. And, you know, he mentioned he beat home favourite Vukic. He did that in 5 sets, and that's the third successive 5-set game he's come through. So that what is so exceptional about him, he's only 23, but he just has that mindset where you kind of sense that he could go pretty far. Whether he has the capability to be up there with the likes of Murray, Djokovic, Federer, I'm not sure yet, but it's really exciting. And I think this match against Carlos Alcaraz, who, as you say, is definitely in line to, I think, be the next big thing. This will be a really exciting match. And, you know, I think having that underdog mentality, what he did at the US Open, he'll be confident that he can pull off an upset here. So, as you say, anything can happen on the day, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for Jack Draper, because it's so nice to have another British talent after Andy Murray to get behind. Obviously, we've got Emma Raducanu as well, who's in action tomorrow, but so nice to have both of them just, fighting for the Brits.
What's the vibe around Emma? Because, you know, she had that tremendous achievement and all this momentum, and then injury after injury, change of coach after change of coach. Is Emma starting to turn a corner, do we think?
I really hope so. And it's so funny because she was speaking about Luke Littler, who obviously won the PDC World Darts Championships a few weeks ago. And she was speaking about how she was actually trying to kind of take inspiration from him. She was so successful at such a young age when she won the US Open. And then, as you say, she had a really difficult journey, not only with injuries, but I think just with the attention that surrounded her. Finally, I think that attention has dissipated a little bit, and she's free to play her own game a bit more. I mean, she's got a really tough match tomorrow up against Iga Swiatek, who's the second seed. So again, she's going to have to pull off an upset if she wants to get through this. But finally, you know, you see her smiling. She looks like she's enjoying her tennis again. And that's what she did when she won the whole thing at the US Open. So hopefully she can replicate that. And with the pressure off her a little bit, maybe that's when she'll play her best tennis.
Well, fingers crossed, because I think she's a tremendous talent. I remember watching with fascination, and I completely understand that on young shoulders, that pressure of winning a title that big in those circumstances, in the US, of all places, must be extraordinary. And I hope that she's now feeling that she's in a better place. And I think Luke Littler can teach a lot of us a thing or two when it comes to taking on pressure. As 17-year-old, I wish I had the same nerve as he did. Now, Uma, thank you so much for joining us, TalkSport presenter, giving us our TalkSport update. We are going to be shortly going to a break. But remember, you are the people. You make talk. So please call 0344 499 1000. Text in word talk to 87222, or message us on X at talkTV. We look forward to seeing you back after the break, and thank you so much for being here on the home at Talk on Common Sense.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here to the Home of Common Sense with me, Jonathan Gullis, on Talk. Former Conservative Member of Parliament, former Deputy Chairman on the Home of Common Sense, that is Talk. And we're getting straight in to the next big story. We saw The Sun this week did some amazing work in calling out the fact that BBC had failed to realise that someone they were promoting, a drill rapper, I know I sound odd when I say that, Jake Fahari, 35 years old, was being promoted on their station for his music, which glamorised the murder of Jimmy Mizzen, a young man that he himself, Fahari, had murdered, had been sentenced to prison for. He was given a life sentence in 2009 with a minimum term of 14 years. What an absolute joke. Jimmy, the victim, was 16 years old at the time of his death. It's turned out that the Sun's work has actually led to Mr. Fahari, and I'm being polite in calling him out, the scumbag, scrote and savage that is Mr. Fahari, has been recalled to prison for breaching his parole. I am aghast that this individual was even allowed out of prison, let alone the BBC feigned to do some basic Google searching to realise that this scumbag had no right to be promoting music, let alone glamorising the murder that he committed, as well as obviously promoting a form of music that is excited about violence rather than actually talking in a poetic way. I'm someone who is a fan of rap music, but drill rap is all about glamorising drugs, glamorising guns, glamorising knives, glamorising postcode wars. It has no place, in my opinion, in the music scene. But I'm delighted to be joined by Ken Hines down the line, who is a knife crime campaigner, and I'm keen to get Ken's view on this. Hello, Ken, how are you? Oh, sorry, Ken, I couldn't hear you there. I think you were muted. So we're going to quickly come back to you. Don't you worry, my friend. I want to make sure I get your views, okay? Hello, Ken. I think you're back now.
Yes. Sorry, yeah. First of all, I would like to... I'm really saddened that this has happened to the family of Jimmy. I know the parents well. You know, they're very lovely people, and they should not be having to face this continuing barrage of, you know, unfortunate news. I'm also saddened that after serving over 14 years in prison, that this young man, you know, hasn't really learnt a lesson, you know, and I now feel, what kind of support do they have in prison to really look into that mindset and change that mindset? We saw that 40-year-old. I'm all for positivity. I don't want to stop artistic creation around the music, but when it impacts people talk about murder and really horrendous things that they would like to do or have done, it's, you know, it's only right that he's recalled back to reflect on his action.
I agree with you, Ken. I think I'm disappointed. Not only has Jimmy's family unnecessarily had to go through the pain of reliving the trauma, as you rightly say, and I'm delighted they've had someone like you in their home to actually support them or give them advice, and as someone who will understand about this issue better than most, I am deeply upset as well that, as you say, a 14-year sentence has not been enough of a lesson for an individual to understand that glamorising the horrific crime they committed does not show any remorse whatsoever, and they're fortunate, in my opinion, to be walking the streets. I personally believe, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm happy for you to challenge me, Ken, that people like this should be locked up indefinitely, that they are dangerous to society, they cannot be reformed if they're willing to carry knives or guns or indeed use other weapons in order to commit horrific crimes. Am I wrong in that? Can people really reform?
I will have to disagree with you, because, you know, I'm a living example of a person who's changed. Because as a young man, I was incarcerated for things I've done. And I'm not saying everyone comes about change, but I found the change in me. From being a selfish person, I now become selfless to help other vulnerable people. I'm not comfortable with what I did as a young man, but nonetheless, you know, I had to take the bull by the horn and really go out there and try to make a difference in my community. And fortunately, I find as a mentor, as part of other groups, community against violence, actually going and having that street engagement with these youngsters to try to change their mindset and get them to recognise that we all got the red mist in us and trauma, but if we can give them the tool to recognise it and to deal with it more effectively, that's the positive things in my life.
Now, do you personally think, Ken,
as it happened to me, and as I said, I'm living proof it can work.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Ken, and I accept that people can change, and I think that was a good lesson for me, to be perfectly frank. Now, I'm keen to get your view here. Is this more of a failure of the parole board? Because surely they should have been aware of Mr. Fahir's movements. They should have been monitoring him much more closely, as well as providing him the necessary support that he may have needed upon his release. Is this a systemic problem with our parole system that you're finding from the work that you do with those who have offended and are coming out and trying to rehabilitate, as well as victims' families of these horrific crimes? Do you think the parole board is actually ultimately to blame here?
I don't think so. I don't believe the parole board. I don't think probation, who's undermanned, and they just really got too much casework. I feel it's a failure of the young man himself, because he has to hold himself accountable. And fortunately, we've got things in place, safeguards in place that, like the Sun, that can unmask people like Ted, and also make the BBC realise that they've also got a responsibility for the sort of music that they're pushing out there, because it does have an adverse effect on young people in my community.
And do you think we need to see much more proactive community engagement from our police forces? Do we need to see more stop and search? I'd be someone who said to Staffordshire Police, I'll happily share it with you, my chief constable, I said that the most prolific knife carriers in our community and drug runners, they should be harassed and stopped and searched on a daily basis, so we can lock them up for good for when they eventually make a mistake, to get them off our streets. These are the people wreaking havoc on many of our communities. Is tough law and order what we need, or would you argue that actually we need to have more of a caring approach? I know that many, I'll be frank, Conservative colleagues of mine would talk regularly about actually we need to be preventative, and when those who have been arrested have ended up in prison, we need to see much more focused on the rehabilitation of an individual, rather than someone like me who is much more about find the criminal, lock them up and throw away the key.
That's only kicking the ball down further down the road, because when that person comes out, who's coming back out in our community? My thing is, stop and search has a role to play, but that role has to be intelligent-led, because currently less than 3% of their stop and search is for weapons. And what I find that is really disturbing, less than 12% of their stop and search lead to an arrest. So that 78% leads to no arrest, and much of that, 7% of that, it leads to no further action. But the interaction between that, with the police and that young person could lead to, first of all, that person being stopped and scarred, and secondly, that person no longer happiness to the police. Instead of going to police when something happens to them, like they've suffered a victim of crime, they take the law into their own hands. It's unacceptable for anyone out there to walk with any kind of weapon. If you feel you have to walk with a weapon, then I would advise you, don't go out, stay in.
Can I say thank you so much, Ken, for joining us. That's Ken Hines, who's a knife crime campaigner and stop and search campaigner as well. It was good to have his view on the show. Dan, I thought I'd quickly come to you there. Ken's talking about the fact that most stop and search doesn't actually lead to arrest, and that actually the interaction is important to monitor because it could lead people to become disaffected. What do you think? Do you think stop and search is a good tool, a useful tool, a tool that should be used much more by our forces?
I have to say I agree with a lot of what Ken said there, particularly about the ability for people to change. On stop and search, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. I think actually one of the questions that isn't being talked about with this very sad and tragic case is the role social media is playing. Social media is glorifying violence. This chap had a YouTube channel where obviously he was having hits of his on his videos and potentially income from YouTube driven by the algorithm to then promote it to more young people. Social media is not a good thing in this age, and I actually think that needs to be looked at as well.
Do you think we have a good enough parole system? I mean, in Stoke-on-Trent we've got a number of charities that work with those who have left prison to rehouse them, rehome them, as well as obviously then use services supplied by the city council, the local council. I think this is important for listeners to understand. That interaction of everyone thinks the MP does everything. Actually, the councils are very important in what they do. And in many cases, in my personal opinion, councils are underpaid. If you want better quality, you need to pay a bit more to the councillors to make sure that they can spend more time scrutinising the work of the officers. Do you think the parole system has a role to play here to do much better? Probation services, be able to monitor? Or is it just a case that it's always going to be an overstretched service?
I think it's a lack of opportunity for people who have served their time and have changed. There isn't a great number of opportunities for them to go out there and get employed and to earn an honest living. I know of cases where people have been let out, they've been given a council property, but they were unable to get a job. So what happened there was they couldn't access certain benefits, and they ended up re-offending just to go back inside, because that's the only way that they could really afford to live, incredibly tragically. So I think it's not so much about the parole board and the probation service, but it's about the employers giving fair opportunities out there to people who come out and who are genuinely reformed.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Councillor Daniel Jellyman from Stoke-on-Trent City Council is probably a bit more compassionate than I am. Maybe I need to go away and realise that people can change. I just think if you're mad enough to take a knife from the street, can you really ever change that mentality? Maybe in a different environment, maybe with a bit of education, maybe. And I think the biggest issue we do have actually is parole services releasing people back into the communities in which they were committing crime and being around the people that were helping them to commit crime. If they weren't living in that area,
but
then
they've been sentenced and they've served their time and they've been let out. So you then got to believe that that person has got a second chance. You can't just say you've done that once. That's it. Now you're
banging these
off.
people up for longer, Dan. I think they should be in prison for longer. We need to build more prisons. You know, we need to be looking at building prisons off islands that we have off the coast of our great nation in order for certain people to never see the light of day, as far as I'm concerned. But maybe with this, maybe with youngsters in particular, if they fall into crime, we have to find a way to rehabilitate. We shouldn't give up in the belief that there's good in people. That would be something that your and I, Christian upbringing, certainly would have been espoused to. And I think that you're fair, you're challenging me. My wife would agree with you, by the way. That's the most important thing. Now, we've had a few texts come in. I just want to show readers. We've had about Susan Hall, who said that, effectively didn't say that she would be supporting Alex Wilson, the Reform UK members' amendment to the budget, which would see 1,000 more police officers in the street. And one listener's come in with Susan Hall's attitude to not supporting the Reform Party's amendment is typical of the Conservative Party's arrogance. That's regarding the budget at the Greater London Authority. Gaz has messaged in, Jonathan Gullis, loving your show, please do more. I'll make sure that Ricky, who is in charge of booking me, sees that and hopefully gets some more gigs. And Ryan, my excellent producer, who's managing me, and that's a tough job, believe me, behind the screen, will see that as well. And then another one here from Jeanette. Hello, Jonathan. You are 100% right that the Tories have failed the voters. When Boris was leader, my husband and myself voted for them, but we are not going to ever vote for the Tories ever again. We will be voting for the Reform Party, so the Tories will be toast for several years. The Labour Party are going down the same road. And then another one from Jenny in Oxford. I think this is an interesting one. Jonathan, CCHQ, for those of you who don't know, Conservative Campaign Headquarters, had a lot to do with candidate selection for constituencies, and we ended up with a lot of what she's called wet Tories. I want to reaffirm what she's called. I certainly would have probably used those words behind the scenes from some of those colleagues, but I want to let them know that this is Jenny's words and not mine. Now, some of these people are now in Reform head office. What is to stop them doing the same? How interesting. An accusation at the doors of Reform that they're happy to let in, as Jenny would say, wet Conservatives, and indeed, what does that mean? I don't know. All I know is that we should take the threat of Reform very seriously indeed. Daniel, again, actually, I just want to come back to this Reform point, because I think it's going to haunt the Conservative Party for a little while longer. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where we have to do a deal with Reform, or do you think a deal with Reform ultimately just leads to the end of the Conservative Party?
A deal with Reform does lead to the end of the Conservative Party. You'll end up like a liberal social democratic alliance that then became the Lib Dems and forever have always been the third party and, you know, a niche to a certain part of the electorate. The Conservative Party's got to destroy Reform in the same way as we've got to destroy the Labour Party as well. We've got to be the party once again for the whole nation with sensible policies that people agree with, and at the moment I'm not seeing that coming out of CCHQ, and that's of great concern.
Is there one policy you would like to see the Conservatives either reverse or introduce? put you on the spot.
Well, I actually think the whole argument about tariffs is really interesting, particularly with the Trump presidency. We've left the EU, we're in control of our own trade now. Is now the time for Britain to start putting tariffs to bring back jobs? As we saw in America under the first Trump term, is now the time for this country to look at tariffs again to protect ourselves from China and other places importing cheap goods and undermining British jobs.
Well, there we go. Time for Trump's tariffs to make its way to Britain's shores, something that I'm certainly sympathetic to, I must say, and I would love to have a conversation about that later on. We've got a quick call here from Dave in Southend, who's actually, I think, going to challenge me and the Conservative Party about our record when it came to grooming gangs, which I'm delighted, and it's important here on the home of free speech, on the home of common sense, to have challenge to us as presenters and our political views. Hello, Dave, how are you?
Good evening, Mr. Gullis. The reason I phoned up is that I was dismayed at your rant at John Rentoul. I'll give you a due. John Rentoul's an idiot. I can't stand the man.
He's a good guy. I must say, Dave, he's a good guy. I promise you, he's a good guy.
I'm not interested in your two-faced attitude. That's what politicians do. He is an idiot, and most of the people know that he's an idiot. The fact is this. One, if we want to get back money into the councils, get rid of all the top people, and there'll be plenty of money. So I've solved the council's problems there. But my issue is with you. Your rant is a disgrace because what your lot done in 14 years, whatever's left of this great country, you've handed over to this dictatorship, and I am not a Labour supporter. This is a dictatorship, is that you're doing. Because you were so useless and so disgraceful that there was no other option but to try the Labour Party, and God help the rest of this country in the next 4 years. But how dare you sit there and pontificate when you destroyed our armed forces, you destroyed... Where's the 40 hospitals that Boris Idiot Johnson promised us? You did nothing about the grooming gangs, and this goes back to Margaret Thatcher's days. You did nothing. You increased immigration. You did nothing for this country except squabble like silly little children, and you wonder why you're never going to be trusted again. And I'll put this straight to you. I don't trust Nigel Farage either. He is for himself. But we are in a state now whereby the country don't trust our politicians. If it was down to me, I'd throw a lot of you out of Parliament for what you have done to us.
Well, Dave, can I say, first of all, that was a very powerful call, an important call. And can I just let you know that there's a lot of things that you've thrown that I don't disregard, I don't treat with disdain. In fact, I hear you. I generally understand the anger that was out there. Believe me, I was out on doors hearing the same things you're saying over and over again. I like to think that I've listened and I'm trying to understand where the Conservative Party went wrong and how, if it can ever rebuild to win your trust. I do think there were things that we did well in government. I think our education record was outstanding. As someone who worked in that sector before entering Parliament, to see the increase in educational outcomes and standards, both at the young age with phonics and in the educational outcomes improvement of GCSE grades, which Labour I now think is tearing apart and I think is an abomination. And we'll be talking to Catherine Birbalsingh later on about it. I also think there were things that we did regarding law and order when it came to increasing sentences for certain crimes. We did indeed have inquiries into certain child sexual offences. We did indeed have that task force under Suella Braverman that saw 500 plus more people put in prison. I do think there are things the Conservative Party should be proud of, but I agree that we shouldn't come on here and carp and be proud and pretend that everything was fine. I think Kemi Badenoch said so herself yesterday. And I'm just intrigued, is there ever a way the Conservative Party might be able to win over your trust? Or do you think the Conservative Party, as far as you're concerned, dead to you?
Once again, you're not reading the room, are you? You had an 80-seat majority. All you're going on about is some pathetic bill in the education. Our country has been destroyed in the last 14 years. You have mullered it. Our streets are in a terrible state. You've done nothing about law and order. That is absolute rubbish. And typical politician, you're not reading the room. You try to find excuses and try to find platitudes when you should all be out of a job. A lot of you in Parliament, what you did in COVID, what you've done to people that never got any money for help in that time, Johnson's shutting our country down.
Dave, I will challenge you on the money in COVID. We did spend £400 billion on giving people furlough, 80% of their salary, giving lots of small businesses on their high streets in particular grants that they've never had to repay back, as well as interest-free loans in some cases. This government really did, well, the former, Conservative government, on COVID was spending money hand over foot, in my opinion.
Absolute rubbish. You didn't have to spend that money. You paid the country to toe the line. That's what that was about. What about all the money you gave to all the cronies for so-called PPE? What about all the money you gave to your mates? It's all disgraceful. You politicians do not see or read the room. The country is crumbling. We're falling apart, and it's the public that are suffering day after day. Not you lot in Parliament on your 100,000 a year and your expense sheet.
I was sacked, Dave. Let's not forget, I was sacked by the electorate of Stoke-on-Trent North. I'm not on £100,000 a year, and I know there's rumours about my net worth on social media. I promise you, if someone wants to spend me the £4.9 million that allegedly I'm owed from the rumours, I would gladly take it. But I believe you and me, none of my mates got PPE contracts. I don't know anyone's mates who got PPE contracts. In fact, I remember at a time that we had a desperate situation where we needed PPE, and the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives all united in calling for action. In fact, Rachel Reeves herself wrote in with suggestions too. We were trying to get PPE because China, who we became over-reliant on, were hogging the PPE in their country and drip-feeding it out and gifting it, essentially, in order for us to be grateful to them, whilst then flooding the market at different times, which was ramping up the price. I'm not trying to make excuses. I've said sorry multiple times on this channel and others for what the Conservatives failed to do in terms of standing up for its values and its beliefs, as well as in terms of failure. But I'll also not have it that every politician is somehow dodgy or corrupt, because I met many good people who did many good things, genuinely with the heart and their passion for their community. And whilst they maybe didn't get that always across, because it's hard to in a crowded social media platform, or because indeed it may have been difficult to have their voices heard because obviously of other issues such as COVID, there are many good people on all sides of the House who want to do right by this country. And I want to make sure I push back and challenge on that.
I believe the only way you lot in Parliament are going to see sense is when you suffer the way the public are suffering. You lot never suffer. Oh, look at you. Whenever someone kills a politician, a whole life sentence is dished out. You don't hear about, oh, someone's got mental issues. Whole life sentence issued out. Our children are being killed on the street, and you're lucky if the perpetrators are getting at least 5 years. It's a disgrace. You think your lives are worth more than ours. You have destroyed this country, and what's left of it, Mr. Gullis, is going to go down the pan with this dictatorship, and it's your fault. And I don't think you lot will ever get to see the light of day this side of 20 years. But I'll give you this, though, Mr. Gullis, and I'll tell you now, to all the people in this country, I guarantee you this country will vote Starmer and his dictatorship back in again, because that's how stupid we are.
Dave, can I say thank you for your call? I really appreciate it, and I'm always happy to take challenge, and I hope the listeners heard that. I'm being in big trouble because we've overrun, and I'm being told we must go to a break by my producer Ryan, so I'm going to put the blame on him now. But I would have had that chat for hours on end, which is why we do need to go to a break. So remember, you're here on the home of Common Sense at Talk. Tune in after the break.
changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. What a beautiful name. The Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, Canada and the United States, that would really be something. All hell will break out in the Middle East, and it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here to the home of Common Sense at Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis. We're going to get straight into our next story with Major General Chip Chapman, who is the ex-head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Hello, Major General, how are you?
Good evening, Jonathan.
Can I quickly get straight into this, sorry? The size of the British military is not expected to increase under the Strategic Defence Review, the Times understands. Plans are being discussed, however, for a, quote, Homeland Defence Force, end quote, which sounds a bit Dad's Army-ish, I must confess, after there was budget constraints that will see no increase in personnel numbers, leaving us with the smallest military since the Napoleonic era. Is this something that should worry us?
I think it should. It should worry us because of the geopolitics of where we are at the moment with Russia, some of the threats with Trump, and that Europe should stand more on its own 2 feet and raise GDP spending on defence. And actually today there was a very canny move by Lithuania, which said it's going to increase GDP to between 5 and 6% by 2026. That's good signalling from Lithuania. No, I don't think we're going to get anywhere near 5 or 6%. And I think if you are going to raise GDP, it would be best to do it within the framework of NATO operations, or NATO meetings. So the current 2% actually comes from the Celtic Haven meeting in Cardiff in 2014. It gave NATO 10 years to get to the 2%. 23 of the 32 did, so there's still some outliers, and some of those are big ones, France and Germany. So I think it would be better to nestle it within that. But good signaling from Lithuania. From our perspective, we have to be careful what we say about the military, because the military should really embrace all 3 services here. I think really that's referring to the army. The army was supposed to go down to 73,000 by 2025, i.e. this year. Actually, the real problem is that both the recruiting and retention are out of balance. So we're losing 300 more than we're gaining each month. It wouldn't surprise me if we're below 70,000 and into the 60s within a few months.
Now, Major General, I was fortunate to spend time with the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme and actually with the Army, and you are indeed correct, so the 70,000 is referring specifically to the Army, and see those brave men and women on the front line. And I was told with recruitment intention there was a large amount that, yes, pay is always something, but actually the poor quality of accommodation, the poor welfare in some cases, the quality of the food in other areas as well. Are these challenges that have been going on for decades, or have things been getting worse as we've been putting more and more pressure on armed forces to step up when we've needed them? For example, I can think of the Olympics or flooding, when we require those services to come out and assist the Environment Agency and our police forces. Or is it just a case that we've not taken defence seriously enough because we've lulled ourselves into a false sense of security, having not seen war in Europe until obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, if you look at the 3 major factors which govern outflow at the moment, pay is one of them. The second one is the work-life balance, and the third one is the opportunities elsewhere. Now, the work-life balance one is a really interesting one, because the smaller you have an army and the more people within that army are sort of broken by injury or whatever, that puts more burden on those who have to do repeat tours all around the world. That was certainly the case for example, my son, who left 18 months ago. He just wasn't a repeat offender and being sent places because there were rare breeds. And that's the problem. You have rare breeds in certain skill trades who are getting thrashed, and they're the ones who ultimately leave. The second part of the Venn diagram is to do this home defence. Now, actually, many years ago, in the early zeros, early noughties, we were talking about the 4 Fs when we had fuel, floods, foot and mouth, and the fire strike. At the same time as, for example, we were going to fight the Second Gulf War. Let's not forget that op fresco, the firefighting in 2002, 2003, 23,000 people were placed on that from the armed forces across all 3 services. Now, actually, what was happening at that time was that it was deemed to be a failure of policy to use the military, and that there was going to be more civil resilience. Now, if we're going to switch that back and use the armed forces for more military tasks, that to me is a bad thing. That's not to say that under military aid to the civil authorities, there are troops who are not available to do that. We do have that. We have a thing called op tempora, for example, and we've seen that within the counter-terrorist sphere when, for example, when the country goes to critical, you'll often see soldiers doing substitution for static guards in London, for example, to release critical police who are warranted to arrest people in the way that the military aren't. So getting into that space doctrinally and through policy is something that would sort of worry me. We did have this home service force in the 80s. That was sort of the notion of guarding critical national infrastructure, and there can be some validity in that in terms of, say, fifth columnist saboteurs, but really in the home space what you need is high-end air defense against 21st century missile threats. What's really missing for me is looking at what the vital interests are and then structuring your armed forces organisationally and in capability terms from that. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So, for example, because we're an island nation, our energy flows, our data flows, our food flows are all obviously by ship or underwater. The Navy comes first, integrated air and missile defence probably comes second, along with and concurrent to that the nuclear deterrent. So the Navy and Air Force, very sadly for me as an Army officer, are probably more predominant and should be than the Army. And the Army's always been trying to see what its role is in the future. Is it supposed to be a continental commitment army? Is it an expeditionary army? And we've been sprinkling sort of pixie dust around the world with the sort of Ranger concepts and all this sort of stuff. And we're not quite sure what we're for anymore in the army, whereas that's quite clear what that should be for the RAF and Navy.
Can I just say thank you so much, Major General, for your service to our country. Thank you so much for that very interesting and detailed analysis of the situation. I'm really glad that we had you here on Talk, and I hope that when I'm presenting, we can get you on again and for longer. And that was ex-Major General Chip Chapman, the former head of counterterrorism at the Ministry of Defence. You're with me, Jonathan Gullis, here on the home of Common Sense at Talk. Remember, 0344 499 1000. Texting the word Talk to 87222 or message us on X at talkTV. We're taking a short break and we'll be back with you soon.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here with me, Jonathan Gullis, on the home of common sense at talkTV. I'm delighted to be joined by my next guest, who is the incredible Catherine Berbelsing. I will make it no small known that I'm a huge fan of Catherine and the work that she's done at the Michaela Community School. Indeed, was fortunate enough to visit on 2 occasions prior to being elected as a Member of Parliament. And the reason we've got Catherine on is because she's written what I would call a damning letter to the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, who I personally believe is one of the most dangerous ministers in this government, over her children's wellbeing and schools bill, and ripping up what I would call the political consensus since Tony Blair around academies, the freedoms of heads when it comes to delivering pay and curriculum. And I'm delighted that she's joining us here on Talk today. Hello, Catherine, how are you?
Hello, Jonathan. I'm very well, thank you.
I know, sorry, I am being sycophantic, and I know you don't care for that much, so I won't do any further because you'll tell me where to go, which I think you've actually done before, which is good, by the way. Catherine, what compelled you to write this letter? I mean, it is incredibly detailed and really does, in my opinion, rip up this schools bill that Labour's putting through and actually brings back the reality that why would Labour expend so much energy so early on its premiership to rip up something that's so obviously been working?
Yes. Indeed. So that's been my main concern. Obviously, you are very excited when a new education secretary comes in. You want to see what they're going to do. And I've been watching and rather sort of behind my hands, as it were. And I've been increasingly worried. And in particular, this bill worries me. She wants to take away the freedoms that academies have to be able to provide what is a bespoke, tailored curriculum and pastoral care for the children of any given school. The idea that everything should be exactly the same in every single school across the country, that we head teachers are unable to make the right decisions for our own intakes. We have different buildings, we have different staff, we have different challenges when it comes to staff recruitment and retention. The idea that we all face exactly the same pressures is just absurd. And this diktat coming from centralized government to force all of us to be exactly the same, I think really is just political blindness. And I do worry that this is an ideology that she is pushing forward. She isn't speaking to the top performing schools in the country. And so I very much would like to encourage her to do exactly that and to visit these schools, because I think if she were to do that, she would find that we share a lot in common. We offer a traditional education with a traditional discipline where we expect the very highest of children. And it means that we enable social mobility for our very poorest. And I know that Bridget Phillipson is keen on helping the poor, but what worries me is that all of these reforms will do exactly the opposite of what she intends and actually harm the poor greatly.
I think what concerns me here, Catherine, and I think you've pointed out, is the idea, like you say, that one size fits all. And actually, I'll say this to listeners, is that when I visited your school on those 2 occasions, and once actually when I was elected as a Member of Parliament with a few of my intake, you made it abundantly clear to everyone that I ever saw you with that we're more than welcome to come and look at what you're doing and indeed take some ideas, but it cannot be copy and pasted, and do not presume what you do at Michaela can work anywhere else, like I was at the time in Stoke-on-Trent. And I find it bizarre. I think you wrote something in your letter which I thought was perfect. This sentence alone: what was the problem you are trying to solve? And I think that sentence sums up what on earth is this bill about. I mean, with what's being proposed, what freedoms would be taken away from you, if you don't mind giving some examples in terms of what you would try and do at Michaela, which is, as I say, one of the best performing schools, which Bridget Phillipson seems unable to say well done to?
Yes. Well, uniform, for instance, is something that really concerns me. Not allowing schools to have various items of branded uniform. And I realise that she will be thinking, well, branded pieces of uniform cost more, and they do. But there's a reason why schools have this. The England football team, when it goes out on the pitch, they all wear the same shirts so that they can see each other when they're passing far down the field. Similarly, when your children are getting on the buses far down the road, their backs are on their bag. You want to be able to see that it's one of your children, and then that they're safely getting on the bus, and that if they're being hassled by people and so on, you need to look after them. There's a reason why we all wear the same blazers, so that we're all part of the same team. Ties are used to denote the prefects and the future leaders and so on in various schools. You know, there are reasons why we do this. And the thing is, she just assumes that we don't care about the poor. All of these schools will have second-hand uniform drives where the year 11s bring back their old pieces of uniform, or when they're growing, actually throughout the years, the children bring back their uniform and then we sell them back. And some families in all schools will be exempt from paying for those branded items precisely because they're unable to afford it. So this idea that we should destroy the sense of team and belonging, and she says that she wants children to belong to their schools because she rightly recognizes that attendance is a real problem since the pandemic. So children need to feel like they belong to something. Well, that something is their school, just like the football players belong to their team, England. If they're not all wearing the same shirt, they can't recognize each other on the field. It's the same thing in a school. And so I just feel like some of these decisions are being made with little understanding of what a school would need. And I get that. She's not a teacher. She's not a school leader, which is why it's so important that she should be speaking to us. I've now obviously invited her to Michaela, and I'm hoping that she will come. There are other top schools that I have suggested that she could also visit and see some of the things that we have in common. We will have much that will be different because we will have different intakes and different buildings and different challenges and so on. But there will also be threads that we have in common, and that she should see what those are. And because at the moment, I really do think she's making an enemy of the good, you know, of what is working, and trying to change things that are not broken. She, for instance, stopped this wonderful Latin grant. These children, and I say this as a head teacher who is not offering Latin to our pupils. So it's not that I'm so bent on Latin. But the fact is that there are schools across the country in very deprived areas offering now, because they've got this grant, giving poor children the chance to compete with the boys at Eton who are learning Latin. And in the middle of the year, just before their GCSE exams, she's pulled the money. So what happens to those teachers? And what happens to those children who now are moving forward towards the GCSE exams without a Latin teacher? I mean, the whole thing is just absolutely horrifying. I just don't understand it. I just don't understand.
Catherine, I'm with you on this. It makes me angry because it is class warfare, as I say, and ideological. And people don't realise with what you're doing at Michaela, you haven't come in to cosy up to the private schools. You've come here to prove a point that you can beat the private schools in the state sector by having rigorous discipline, a knowledge-rich curriculum, and ensuring that pupils are well fed. And I implore anyone in the public, so I know that you have this rule, who wants to come along, book your place, make sure you see it in person. I find it gobsmacking that she has not already, one, had some sort of meeting with you, and two, not arranged a visit, because your school's results speak for themselves. And when they come out year after year proving the point that what you're doing is working, then we should be taking lessons from people like you. And I was proud when the last Conservative government, who I know that you were brave enough to be critical about as well when we got things wrong. And like you've said previously, it doesn't necessarily mean that you gave us your vote either in previous elections, but you were happy enough to say when we were doing things right as much as we were doing things wrong. And the reason we championed you was not to just cosy up to you, is because genuinely what you were doing was actually making a difference in a deprived part of a London community. And if we have things like that achieved in Stoke, I'm livid, for example, with the pay changes that are going to come in. In Stoke-on-Trent, it's so hard to recruit some of the best English, maths and science teachers. And now we're taking away from the schools to be able to pay that extra bit of money to recruit the best from London or the South East, where there are probably more opportunities and increased pay salaries on the current fixed national pay scale that we have. Would you agree?
So what you're pointing to there is exactly what I've said. Different schools face different challenges, and some schools who are thinking this is a real problem with recruitment, well, then they decide, you know what, we're going to cut in various other ways in the school, and we're going to give more to the teachers' salaries. And so she's promised not to cut teachers' salaries. Well, a whole load of academies out there currently pay more than the national pay scales. So she's cutting their salaries. The teachers will lose money if this bill goes through. And I'm not sure teachers realize this. If they're working in an academy chain where they're paying more than the national pay scales, teachers salaries will be cut with this bill.
In the middle of a recruitment and retention crisis as well, of all things.
Exactly. I just can't understand any of it. I don't understand it.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us and sharing us your thoughts and for that letter you put out today. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you not in the too distant future. And that's been Catherine Belsing, the head of Michaela Community School and the co-founder of it too. Before we let Daniel Jellyman, councillor for Stoke-on-Trent City Council and former deputy leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council, go, I just want to get, Daniel, your views on education in general. Do you think this is a backwards move in an area like Stoke, which continues sadly to be in the bottom 20%, in an area like Stoke where Labour built 80 plus schools under PFI contracts that just saw shiny buildings built, with lots of debt having to be repaid and no actual improvement in education outcomes? Are you worried about taking away freedoms of academies that you will work with as a councillor in your local area?
Oh, absolutely. We've got to improve education standards, not have some ideology, as the guest has just said. It's a socialist government. They are attacking education. You've seen that with the VAT on private and independent schools. Now they're getting rid of parent choice, and they're getting rid of the choice of the teachers to teach what's needed for that class. And we're getting to the point where you still have directors of schools. A local school in Stoke, the director's on almost £1 million, yet the school can't even afford glue sticks. That's what the government should be focusing on instead of tinkering around the edges as they're doing in this bill.
Well, I think that's a great point, and it is true indeed that I think you used your ward budget, didn't you, to help one of those schools where as I say, the director is on over £1 million a year salary. How can anyone justify that when it comes to the future of our children? It's been great to have Councillor Daniel Jellyman on the show today. We're delighted to have him, and we look forward to having him on back again. I'll be joined soon by the great Kevin O'Sullivan to tell us what's going on in his show and to wrap up some calls and text messages towards the end. It's been great having you here on Talk, the home of common sense, with me, Jonathan Gullis. We'll see you shortly.
The roads in London might be one thing, but if you get outside London, they're even worse. The thing to do is to make sure that the government is going to fund local authorities properly to repair these roads, rather than what's happening at the moment. They're having to scrimp and save. They fill in the potholes as best they can. Some do a good job, some don't. But I think what will infuriate your listeners in a number of areas of the country is they put in the tarmac into these potholes, and 2 or 3 months later they come out again because they haven't done a proper job.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, welcome back here to the final minutes of me, Jonathan Gullis, on Drive Time here at the home of common sense, which is Talk, and we're going to get to some text straight away. We've got Heather in Buckinghamshire. that caller Dave, who let's just say I think told me a thing or two, had a lot, speaks for a lot of us. He was spot on the money, but well done, Jonathan, for letting him on and letting him speak. And another one, Mark from Norwich. Jonathan, thank you so much for listening to Dave. You have just catapulted yourself into the elite of the elite and beyond. Even the very best of the previous best would have cut Dave off because it would have been too uncomfortable and awkward for them. But you let Dave have his say, and that's just absolutely incredible and awesome. In the country obsessed with silencing people right now, you are only hope. Look, I'm a big believer that we should be able to listen to hard conversations. When I was a member of Parliament, I remember spending more time on the doors of people who disagree with me, because it's important to listen to those people, to understand what it was I or my party, or indeed just politics in general, was doing wrong, what we were not understanding in terms of the issues that actually matter rather than what people on X try and tell us that matters, and understanding where it is that our political discourse is. I think trust in the two-party system has never been so low. I'm dreadfully worried for both Labour and Conservatives. If they don't get their act together, if they don't offer credible alternatives, then we are going to see a complete breakdown of the two-party system, and there'll be the Greens, Liberal Democrats and Reform waiting to pick up. And I say that as someone who is, of course, self-interested as a Conservative Party member, that I want to see us achieve and succeed. And I'll always ensure that in free speech, well, that we are here, the home of common sense on TalkSport, that we listen to the hard truths as well as the uncomfortable comments. And I'm sure that whilst that video will do well on social media, I'm not bowing down or being afraid of anyone when it comes to saying what needs to be said and listening to what needs to be heard too. I will take our first caller, Daniel in Epsom, who wants to talk about the idea of 10 years of Sir Keir Starmer, whether or not he's excited for it. Hello, Daniel.
Jonathan, we've ended up with this atrocious, awful, woeful government, and I suppose the people to blame are you and your party. I ran for the Conservative Party in the past, but I'm only going to vote Reform from now. And actually, it's very, very simple. It's very, very simple, Jonathan. You were supposed to be working for us, right, and doing our bidding. And we gave you explicit instructions that over a long period of time that we wanted legal migration cut down to extremely low numbers, and we wanted illegal immigration stopped, right? And we gave you explicit instructions and you didn't do it. So now tens of millions of people like me, even though you worked for us and you're supposed to do what we tell you to do, you didn't do it, right? And now we can't trust you and we can't vote for you again because you've done it before. And you've got the likes of Kelly now saying that she won't leave the ECHR. The only way you can get on top of the immigration issue really is by leaving the ECHR. We need bold government, strong government, people that are willing to listen to what our bidding is and actually do it. You were con-socialist, you were centrist, you were overly liberal. Half of your party have to go. They're Lib Dems in blue ties. They've got to go. You have to reclaim the right. Otherwise, it's absolutely futile, Jonathan. Can't you see?
Well, Daniel, first of all, can I just say that I completely agree with you on the last election, and this is what the Labour Party hasn't actually understood, that it was not a vote for the Labour Party and their agenda, where they actually received 500,000 fewer votes than they got in 2019. In fact, my successor achieved 200 fewer votes than the person I was fortunate enough to beat in 2019. It was a vote against the Conservative Party. It was a vote in anger at the fact that we had failed, as you say, to deliver on some very central and important questions. In my area, levelling up, they didn't see the change quick enough. The roads were a mess. Obviously, the NHS waiting lists were out of control. And as well, as you say, most importantly, legal and illegal migration was not in a good place. And I just hope that with listening, with time, that we can rebuild your trust, if you think that's even possible.
Yeah, but Jonathan, it's not possible, is it? Because the leadership of your party, number one, half of the party are still Lib Dems in blue ties, right? The weak lot, the centrists, the socialists, they've got to go. You haven't got rid of them. Kemi's saying she's not going to leave the ECHR. So people like me, I can... If the public tell you that we want you to do something, and overwhelmingly in about 2 or 3 elections you promised you would, and then you ignore us, right, we have to then vote for somebody else. I'm going to run for Reform now, and I'm going to do everything I possibly can. They're the only party of the right left in the country. The problem with your party is it's split, and so some of you are on the right, but about half of you aren't.
Well, hopefully you've seen my record. I mean, I did put a bill on the floor of the House to say that we should ignore the ECHR and set a pathway towards leaving it, which actually Sir Keir Starmer voted against when I was about bencher, which is quite an extraordinary feat. And look, I don't disagree that the Conservative Party, I think Robert Jenrick did say it well, became a broad church with no central religion, and Kemi Badenoch's got one hell of a challenge in her hands. And thank you so much, Daniel, for calling, and I wish you all the best in your political future, and I hope that one day the Conservative Party can reclaim you. Kevin, I know that these type of calls you get in regularly. I think it's one hell of a challenge, but look, what's coming up on your great show. I'm sure you're pleased to hear Sadiq Khan dismissing councillors who want to put 1,000 police officers on the street.
Yeah, we did
and
that.
actually, sadly, Conservatives not wanting to back the amendment. And then, of course, Sir Keir Starmer saying he wants to grace us with his presence for 10 years.
Good luck with that, Keir. Did you see also Sadiq Khan when Susan Hall, the Tory leader of the London Assembly, quizzed him about the rape gangs, that he pretended he'd never heard of the grooming scandal? I don't know what you're talking about.
He's meant to be the police crime commissioner, isn't he?
What is wrong with that man? Also, the Reform UK, the single Reform UK guy in the Assembly said, let's all work together to battle knife crime, a cross-party initiative. And he said, I've made it a policy never to work with Reform. I mean...
And do you know what upset me, Kevin? We had Susan Hall on the show, and I asked her would she back the amendment, and she said no. They didn't. The Conservatives will not back the Reform amendment. They said they'll just do their own amendment. I just think this
politicising. Kids are getting killed on the streets.
Let's just put the politics to one side here. I don't care who gets the credit for this. Let's force Sadiq Khan to have 1,000 extra bobbies on the beat, which will upset him because he will have lost an argument in the chamber. And if any Labour lot want to vote against it, they can tell the victims of those who are murdered why they chose to do that.
Absolutely. There's a story today. I'd be interested in your take on it. I think it cuts to the heart of where the Tories have lost their way. Andrea Jenkins' story about her mother, her nearly 80-year-old mother, who liked a few tweets about deporting migrants. They kicked her out of the Tory party. The HQ kicked her out. And only after a campaign by Andrea was she allowed back in, but only after taking a woke diversity course. What do they think they're playing at?
Let's test it. Let's test it, Kevin. Conservative campaign headquarters, as a member of your party and a former member of Parliament, if you've come here illegally, you need to be deported. If you've committed if you're a foreign national offender, committed a crime, deported. If you commit murder, carry knives, steal